The wax seal cracked under Officer Derek Paulson's thumbnail at 11:47 p.m., and the woman sitting in the driver's seat didn't flinch, not even a little. She had warned him twice. He had laughed both times. What Derek didn't know, what nobody in the Harlow County Sheriff's Department knew, was that the document he'd just destroyed had been carrying a federal authorization code linked directly to the Department of Justice's Organized Crime Division. 34 minutes from now, 6 armored U.S. Marshal vehicles would roll into the Harlow substation parking lot, and the nurse he had just handcuffed and dragged out of a battered Honda Civic would be the one walking out the front door while Derek Paulson was walked out in chains. This story already has you on the edge of your seat. Stay until the end, because it only gets more intense from here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The Honda Civic had a cracked left taillight. That was all. A hairline fracture in the red plastic casing, barely 3 inches long, the kind of damage that happens when someone backs out of a hospital parking garage at the end of a double shift and clips a concrete pillar they couldn't see in the dark. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't illegal in any meaningful way that warranted what came next. But Officer Derek Paulson of the Harlow County Sheriff's Department had been sitting in his cruiser for 40 minutes with nothing to do. A cold cup of gas station coffee going stale in the cup holder, and a particular kind of restlessness that made small things look like opportunities. Clocked the Civic heading westbound on Mercer Road at 11:31 p.m. and pulled out behind it. The driver kept the car at exactly the speed limit, 52 miles per hour in a 50 zone. The kind of careful driving that people do when they've got nothing to hide but still don't trust the person behind them with the flashing lights. Paulson ran the plates. The vehicle was registered to a Nora Vass, age 36, no priors, no warrants, current insurance. He hit the lights anyway. The Civic pulled over cleanly on the gravel shoulder. No drama, no sudden movements. Paulson took his time getting out of the cruiser. He adjusted his belt, checked his reflection in the passenger window of his own vehicle, a habit he'd had since the academy, and walked up to the driver's side with a small flashlight already in his hand, angled so the beam would hit the driver directly in the face. The woman behind the wheel wasn't what he expected. She was in blue hospital scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot that had started to come loose hours ago. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been on their feet for 11 straight hours doing something that actually mattered. She already had her license and registration out, held flat against the steering wheel where he could see them. She was not looking at him with the usual mix of guilt and apology that most people wore during traffic stops. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they need to navigate around to get to where they're going. License and registration, Paulson said, even though she was already holding them out. Right there, her voice was even. Not rude, not warm. Functional. He took them without a word, Nora Vass. The photo on the license matched. He shone the flashlight on the registration paperwork longer than was necessary, then back at her face, then at the back seat. Nothing back there except a canvas tote bag with a hospital logo on it and a folded fleece jacket. You know why I stopped you? Taillight, she said. Left side, I'm aware of it. It happened 2 days ago and I've scheduled the repair. That a fact, it is. He walked back to the taillight, crouched, shone the beam at it. Crack was exactly as she'd described it. He stood up, walked back to the window. You coming from Val in general? She glanced at the tote bag. Yes. Late shift? Trauma nursing doesn't have a day shift and a night shift the way people imagine it does. Paulson didn't like that answer. Not because it was hostile, it wasn't, but because it carried the particular quality of someone who had said the same thing many times and was not interested in explaining it again. He leaned against the doorframe, making the conversation slower than it needed to be. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, something closer to calculation. She looked at him for a moment, a single measuring beat, and then she said, Before I do that, I need to tell you something. You can tell me outside the vehicle. I'm informing you now so there's no confusion later. She reached carefully toward the glove compartment, movement slow and visible, opened it, and removed a sealed document. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with a wax seal pressed into the flap and a printed federal return address in the upper left corner. She held it out. This document is a sealed federal instrument. I am not authorized to open it. You are not authorized to open it. If you're going to bring me into the station, this comes with me and is presented to the officer in charge, unopened, within the first 5 minutes of processing. That is the protocol. Paulson looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He took the envelope. I just told you. I heard you. He turned it over in his hands. The seal was genuine enough, looking the kind of thing you could probably print off a good color laser printer if you knew what you were doing. He'd seen fake federal documents before. Once, years ago, a meth distributor out of Kendall had tried to bluff his way through a checkpoint with a forged DEA clearance letter. Paper had been wrong, too bright, too smooth. This felt different, heavier. But Paulson had already made a decision before his brain finished processing the weight of the envelope, the way people make decisions when they've already decided and are just looking for the moment to act on it. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. She got out. She was taller than he'd expected, maybe 5'8", and she moved with the kind of economy that people develop when they spend their professional lives in tight spaces around equipment that could hurt them. Stood on the gravel shoulder with her hands visible, not behind her back, not in her pockets. She was waiting. I'm telling you again, she said. Don't open that envelope. He broke the seal with his thumbnail. The wax cracked in one clean line, and the flap came free, and Paulson unfolded the document inside with the confidence of someone who had already decided there was nothing inside that could threaten him. He read the first 3 lines. Then he read them again. Flashlight moved slowly down the page. Nora Vass stood on the gravel shoulder of Mercer Road and watched him read. This as he stopped. I told you not to open it, she said. Not triumphant, just flat. Paulson folded the document back up. Jaw was tight. Whatever he'd just read had shifted something in his face. The loose, bored confidence was gone, replaced by something that hadn't quite resolved into recognizable emotion yet. He opened the rear door of his cruiser. Get in. Am I being detained? You're being brought in for questioning. On what grounds? Suspected possession of fraudulent federal documentation. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she got into the back of the cruiser without another word. The Harlow County substation at night was the kind of place that felt like it had been built by people who expected law enforcement to be unpleasant and had designed the interior accordingly. Fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious irritation. Linoleum floors the color of old mustard. A booking desk that smelled like burnt coffee and something chemical underneath it that nobody had ever bothered to identify. There were 4 officers in the bullpen when Paulson walked Nora Vass through the door at 11:58 p.m. Deputy Carla Metz, Deputy First Class Theo Brandt, a new hire named Sully whose last name nobody used yet, and Sergeant Raymond Kell, who was technically the ranking officer on the overnight shift and who looked up from his paperwork with the slow, assessing gaze of someone who'd been doing this for 22 years. What we got? Kell asked. Traffic stop. Broken taillight. Carrying what she claims is a sealed federal document. Paulson dropped the opened envelope on the desk. I opened it. The bullpen went quiet in the specific way that bullpens go quiet when something has just been said that everyone in the room understands is a problem, but nobody is ready to say so out loud yet. Kell picked up the envelope. He looked at the broken seal, pulled the document out with 2 fingers, the way you handle something that might be evidence, and read the header. Then he set it down on the desk very carefully and looked at Paulson. Tell me you didn't open this. I just said I did. Derek. Kell's voice dropped to something that was almost private. This has a DOJ watermark. Could be forged. It's not forged. Kell had worked federal liaison cases for 6 years before he'd come to Harlow County. He knew what a DOJ watermark looked like. He knew what the paper stock felt like. He knew the difference between a real federal instrument and a fake one, and the document currently sitting on his desk was real in every way that mattered. He looked at Nora Vass, who was standing calmly near the booking desk, with her hands uncuffed. Paulson had removed them in the parking lot, some instinct for self-preservation kicking in, and said, Ma'am, are you federal? I'm a registered nurse at Vallon General Medical Center, she said. I've been on shift since noon. It was the kind of answer that was technically true, and said everything by saying nothing, and Kell's 22 years of experience recognized it immediately. He looked at the document again. This authorization code. Sergeant. One of the desk phones rang. Not the regular line, the secondary line, the one connected to the federal relay system, the line that had not rung a single time in the 4 years Kell had been stationed at the Harlow substation. Stared at it for a second. Then he picked it up. He listened. His face changed. He set the phone down. He looked at Paulson. He looked at Metz and Brandt and the new hire Sully. He looked at Nora Vass. Then he said, very quietly, everybody stay exactly where you are. And then every electronic system in the substation, the computers, the radios, the security monitors, the electronic door locks went dead simultaneously. The silence that followed was not like regular silence. It was the specific silence of a place where noise had been a constant, a background hum of electronics and communication equipment, and the low-frequency buzz of fluorescent lights. And then all of it stopped at once. The fluorescent lights stayed on. They were on a separate circuit, but everything else was gone. Computers showed black screens. The radio on Brandt's hip produced a single burst of static, and then nothing. The door to the evidence lockup, which required an electronic keypad to open, clicked softly as it engaged its fail-secure lock. Met said, "What just happened?" Kell didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the secondary federal line, which still had a small green light blinking on it, battery backup, indicating the call was still technically connected. Picked it up again. "This is Sergeant Kell, Harlow County Substation 7. I need clarification on." The voice on the other end was calm and official, and gave him very little room to negotiate. Kell listened for approximately 45 seconds, and when he set the phone down the second time, his face had the particular quality of a man who has just been handed information he would have preferred not to have. "There are 6 federal vehicles in the parking lot," Sully said from the window. He'd moved there when the lights went out, some rookie instinct to check the perimeter. "Armored U.S. Marshal insignia." Metz looked at Paulson. Paulson looked at the document on the desk. "Told you it was fake," he said. But the confidence was completely gone from his voice. What was left was something smaller, something that sounded a lot like a man trying to convince himself of something he no longer believed. Derek Kell's voice was absolutely flat. "Shut up." The front door opened. Not broke open, not stormed open. A single U.S. Marshal in tactical gear walked in first, followed by 2 more, and then a 4th who wore a suit rather than tactical gear, and carried a leather document case, and had the bearing of someone who had done this specific thing many times before. He looked at the room, took inventory, and then looked at Nora Vass. "Investigator Vass," he said. She nodded once. "Agent Caldwell." Every officer in the bullpen turned to look at her. Her name was not a cover. Nora Vass was real. The nursing license was real. The 11 years at Vallon General were real. What the officers of Harlow Substation 7 had not known, what nobody in Harlow County had known, was that before Nora Vass had been a trauma nurse, she had been something else entirely. She had spent 6 years as a combat medical specialist attached to a classified military logistics unit that operated in regions where supply chains overlapped with criminal networks, and where the difference between a routine checkpoint and a federal interdiction operation was sometimes measured in seconds. She had left that life with a shoulder that ached in cold weather, and a tolerance for chaos that most people never develop, and a set of skills that the Department of Justice Organized Crime Division had eventually come to find very useful. The undercover placement at Vallon General had been active for 14 months. It wasn't a complicated operation in concept. She was there to observe, document, and confirm a network of extortion and evidence manipulation that the DOJ suspected was running through Harlow County's law enforcement infrastructure, using the county hospital as a processing point for falsified medical reports connected to insurance fraud and illegal asset seizures. The sealed document Paulson had destroyed wasn't just a federal warrant. It was the operational authorization for the raid that had been planned for 48 hours from now, moved up by 11 hours, because Paulson had triggered the emergency protocol the moment he broke the seal. Agent Caldwell set his document case on the booking desk. He opened it and removed a fresh copy of the authorization, the backup, always kept with the coordinating agent, and handed it to Kell. "Sergeant, you're going to want to review Section 3, Paragraph 7. It lists the individuals named in this investigation." Kell read it. His face went through several things in the space of about 4 seconds. "I'm not on this list," he said. "No," Caldwell confirmed. "You're not. Sheriff Braddock is." "Yes." Kell set the document down. He looked at Paulson. Paulson's hands were at his sides, and he was looking at Nora Vass with an expression that was difficult to read, not exactly anger, not exactly fear, something that lived in the complicated territory between those two things. "You were never just a nurse," he said. "I was always a nurse," she said. "I was also something else. You didn't ask. You could have told me." "I did tell you. I told you not to open the envelope." She said it without heat, without satisfaction. Just a statement of what had happened. "You had a choice, Officer Paulson. You made it." The tactical team had moved through the substation systematically evidence room, communications center, the small office at the back that belonged to the watch commander, and which was, on this particular night, occupied not by the watch commander, but by a locked filing cabinet that 2 of the marshals were now photographing before they touched it. Metz and Brandt and Sully had been separated, and were each seated at different points of the bullpen, not under arrest, but not free to move either. Paulson was standing near the booking desk, and nobody had told him to sit, which was either a good sign or a very bad one, depending on how you read the room. "Am I under arrest?" he asked Caldwell. "Not at this moment," Caldwell said, still assessing the scope of what happened tonight. He looked at the broken envelope on the desk. "Destroying or compromising a sealed federal instrument is a federal offense, Officer Paulson. Whether you understood what you were holding is going to be the relevant question. Thought it was fake. Then we'll need to talk about why you thought that and what you did next." Paulson looked at the floor. What Nora Vass had not anticipated, what no one had anticipated, was what was inside the locked filing cabinet in the watch commander's office. The watch commander was Lieutenant Gerald Foss, a 28-year veteran of the Harlow County Sheriff's Department, who had called in sick that evening at 6 p.m., approximately 3 hours after the DOJ had secured the raid timeline, and approximately 2 hours before that timeline could have leaked through any official channel. Coincidence of his absence was noted immediately, logged and flagged. Filing cabinet under his desk was a personal cabinet, not a department-issued 1 gray metal, 4 drawers, secured with a combination lock rather than a key. Standard department property wouldn't have a combination lock. The Marshals photographed it from 4 angles before they drilled it. Inside the bottom drawer, behind a layer of personnel files that looked legitimate, were 8 manila envelopes, sealed with rubber bands, each labeled with a date and marker. The earliest dated back to 31 months ago. The most recent was dated 11 days before tonight. Caldwell looked at the envelopes for a moment without touching them. Then he looked at Nora. "Did your intelligence indicate this?" "We knew Foss was connected," she said. "We didn't know he was keeping physical records." "People sometimes do that," Caldwell said. "Insurance. Or leverage." He nodded slowly. "Get the evidence team in here." Nora walked to the doorway of the watch commander's office and looked at the open cabinet. She had spent 14 months in this county, driving these roads, pulling shifts at Volland General in scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and institutional laundry detergent, sitting in break rooms listening to people complain about overtime schedules while she cataloged names and dates and relationships that she couldn't write down anywhere except in the secured filing system she accessed from a laptop in the parking garage of her apartment complex twice a week. She had been in this substation 17 times during the investigation, brought in with other hospital staff for a series of fake community liaison meetings that Sheriff Braddock had organized as cover for a money processing arrangement with the county's largest construction company. She had sat in these plastic chairs and drunk this terrible coffee and smiled at these people. Looking at the manila envelopes in the cabinet, she felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been performing normalcy for a very long time and has finally reached the point where the performance can stop. Behind her, in the bullpen, she could hear Paulson's voice, not the words, just the cadence, the particular rhythm of someone trying to explain themselves to people who are no longer in a position to help him. She turned away from the cabinet and walked back out. Processing took 3 hours. By 3 a.m., the substation was fully occupied by federal personnel. The original night shift officers had been separated for individual interviews, and the parking lot held 9 vehicles, the 6 armored Marshal units that Sully had counted from the window, plus 2 DOJ vehicles and an FBI forensics van that had arrived 20 minutes after the initial entry team. Communications blackout had been lifted selectively, incoming calls only, no outgoing, with a federal monitoring unit now running through the department's relay system. Paulson sat in interview room B, which was a room he had used hundreds of times from the other side of the table, and which felt geometrically different from this angle. Chair was the same plastic and metal chair, the table was the same scratched laminate, the one-way mirror was the same one-way mirror. Everything was identical. Everything was wrong. Agent Caldwell came in at 3:15 a.m. with a recording device and a pad of paper, and sat across from Paulson without any particular expression on his face. "You want coffee?" "No. Water?" "No. I want to know what's on that list." Caldwell folded his hands on the table. "The list that was in the document you opened." "Yes. 14 individuals. Sheriff Braddock, Lieutenant Foss, 7 additional officers from the department, 2 civilian administrators from county offices, and 2 employees of Halcyon Construction Group, which is the primary entity through which the financial movement was processed." Caldwell paused. "You're not on the list." Paulson absorbed that. Why not? It was, Caldwell thought, a genuinely interesting question, not a guilty man's question, necessarily, but not an innocent man's question either. Question of someone who suspected they should be somewhere they weren't. "What would you like to tell me about your relationship with Sheriff Braddock's financial operations?" Paulson said nothing for a long moment. The fluorescent light above them hummed at the same frequency as the ones in the bullpen outside, and the sound of it was the only thing in the room. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what." "Starting point," Caldwell said. "Let's talk about what you knew." In the parking lot, Nora sat on the hood of a DOJ vehicle with a cup of coffee that was considerably better than the substation. Someone on the federal team had brought a thermos and watched the forensics van's rear doors open and close as technicians moved equipment in and out. Her shift at Vallon General had started at noon and was supposed to end at 11. It was now close to 4 in the morning. She had been awake for 22 hours, and her shoulder was doing the thing it did when she'd been on her feet too long, a low grinding ache that no amount of stretching fully resolved. She drank her coffee. The night air was cold and smelled like wet asphalt and car exhaust, and faintly, from somewhere down Mercer Road, the distant chemical smell of the county's water treatment plant. She had memorized the smell of this county. She had memorized the way the light changed on the Vallon General parking garage at different times of day, and the names of the nurses she worked with, and the medical histories of patients she had genuinely cared for, while also watching for the particular patterns, the falsified discharge paperwork, the missing medication logs, the irregular billing codes that had brought her here in the first place. One of the forensics technicians walked past, stopped, looked at her. "You need anything?" "I'm okay." He nodded and kept moving. She was thinking about the manila envelopes in Foss's cabinet. Envelopes, spanning 31 months. Whatever was inside them, and she could make educated guesses, had been sitting in that cabinet long enough that the earliest as one had probably been placed there before the DOJ operation had even been formally opened, which meant Foss had been keeping records of his own illegal activity, organized by date, in a personal filing cabinet under his desk, for reasons that were either very stupid or very smart. Leverage, she'd said to Caldwell. Or insurance. The question was whether the leverage ran upward toward people on the list or outward toward people who weren't. Caldwell came out of the substation at 4:08 a.m. He stood next to her, poured himself coffee from the thermos, and looked at the forensics van. "Paulson's talking. Is he useful?" "Possibly." He knew the department had financial irregularities. He didn't know the scope. Caldwell drank his coffee. "Targeted you tonight because you were convenient, not because he was directed to." "I know." He thought the envelope was forged, because it was easier to think that than to think about what it meant if it was real. "I know that too." She looked down at the cup in her hands. "What's in Foss's envelopes?" Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "Preliminary review indicates payment records, cash disbursements coded by recipient, and something else we haven't fully processed it yet. But there are what appear to be surveillance photographs. Internal. Department personnel." She looked at him. Foss was watching the other officers. "It appears so." "It's not just insurance," she said. "That's control." Caldwell nodded slowly, which means the financial operation isn't just a corruption case. If Foss has photographs and payment records on other officers, he's been running a coercion structure inside the department. The weight of it settled. Not surprised she had suspected the corruption ran deeper than money, but the specific gravity of confirmation. 14 months of work, of carefully constructed normalcy, of performed routine, and the thing waiting at the bottom of it was uglier and more organized than even the initial intelligence had suggested. She finished her coffee, set the cup down on the hood of the vehicle. "The envelopes changed the case." "They change everything about the case," Caldwell agreed. Down Mercer Road, the first gray light of early morning was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line. She watched it for a moment. "What happens to Paulson?" she asked. "Depends on how cooperative he is and what he can verify. Destroying the warrant is the immediate exposure. Whether he knew what it was is going to matter." "He didn't know," she said. "Not fully. He thought it was fake, because it was easier to believe." "You're saying that helps him." "I'm saying it's true." She slid off the hood of the vehicle and straightened her scrubs, which had been sitting wrong for the last 3 hours. The fabric twisted at the waist. People who hurt this county didn't do it because they were stupid. They did it because they were organized, and they had enough control over the people around them that individual officers like Paulson never had to know the full picture. She looked at the substation door. That's what those envelopes are going to show. Caldwell was watching her with the particular attention of someone who has just heard a piece of reasoning that is about to change how they think about a case. "You're saying the real target isn't the officers. It's whoever Foss was protecting with the coercion structure." "Foss was 28 years in this department," she said. "He didn't build that infrastructure for himself." Caldwell set down his own cup. He looked at the forensics van. He looked at the substation. "We're going to need to pull every record connected to Halcyon Construction Group. You're going to need to pull the county executive's office too, she said. Inside interview room B, Derek Paulson was still talking. He didn't know yet that his answer to Caldwell's first question, "What would you like to tell me about your relationship with Sheriff Braddock's financial operations?" had just opened a door that led to something much larger than a corrupt sheriff and a filing cabinet full of envelopes. Outside, the sky continued to lighten, slow and gray and indifferent, over the Harlow County substation parking lot, the armored vehicles of the U.S. Marshal sat in a patient row, and where Nora Vass stood in her hospital scrubs with her hands in her pockets, looking east, thinking about a name she had heard once, 14 months ago, in a break room at Vallon General, a name that had not appeared on the DOJ's list of 14, but that kept surfacing at the edges of things, in the particular way that names surface when someone has been very careful to keep them from appearing anywhere official. She needed to make a call, not to Caldwell, not to the DOJ relay system, to someone she had not spoken to in 14 months, someone who had given her this assignment and who had told her at the beginning, the money doesn't start here and it doesn't stop here. Pulled out her phone. The battery was at 11%. She walked to the far edge of the parking lot, away from the forensics team and the marshals and the lit windows of the substation, and dialed. It rang twice. The line picked up. "It's Vass," she said. "The raid is clean. Foss kept records. 8 envelopes, 31 months. She paused. "There's a name that's not on our list." The voice on the other end asked a single question. She answered it, and the person on the other end of the line went very quiet. Person on the other end of the line was Deputy Director Marin Solis, and the silence she offered after Nora's answer lasted long enough that Nora checked her phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. It was. Solis was simply thinking, which was something she did at a pace that other people frequently mistook for hesitation. It wasn't hesitation. It was the particular deliberateness of someone who had spent 30 years making decisions that couldn't be walked back. "Say the name again," Solis said. "Harlan Greer." Another pause. "County Executive Greer. He came through the hospital 14 months ago. Routine cardiac monitoring, nothing serious. One of the nurses was trying to make conversation and mentioned she'd seen him at a Halcyon Construction fundraiser the week before. He laughed it off, said something about how everybody in county government goes to those things." Nora was watching the tree line, the gray light filling in behind it. "But I pulled the visitor records for that fundraiser afterward. His name wasn't on the list, which means he attended outside official channels, which means somebody made sure his attendance wasn't documented." Solis said. "Foss? That's my read. Foss has been running coercion inside the department. Caldwell's team found surveillance photographs in the envelopes. If Greer is the upstream connection to Halcyon, Foss would have been managing the insulation layer, keeping the financial pipeline clean by making sure nobody inside the department was in a position to ask questions. The 14 names on the warrant are the layer Foss controlled," Nora said. "Greer is the layer above that, and he's not on any document we've touched so far." Solis was quiet for 4 seconds. "I need you to hold everything you have on Greer internally. Don't share it with Caldwell yet." Nora frowned. "Why?" "Because Caldwell's authorization covers the department and Halcyon. Greer is a county executive. That's a different jurisdiction threshold, and I need to confirm we have the coverage before anything gets moved." Solis's voice was precise, but not cold. It was the voice of someone managing several moving parts simultaneously and trying not to let any of them knock against each other. "I'll have an answer for you by 6 a.m. Can you hold until then? My phone's at 8%. Find a charger, Nora." Call ended. Nora stood at the edge of the parking lot for a moment, her breath visible in the cold morning air, and thought about Harlan Greer's laugh in the hospital room 14 months ago, the loose, comfortable laugh of a man who had never once considered that the woman taking his blood pressure might be listening to him more carefully than his cardiologist. She went back inside to find a charger. The substation's break room had one outlet behind the coffee maker and a phone charger that someone had left plugged in, cable fraying at the connector end in the way that cables fray when they've been yanked out of devices too many times by people in a hurry. Nora plugged her phone in and sat at the break room table and ate a granola bar from her hospital tote bag. She always kept 2 in there, a habit from years of shifts where eating happened in whatever gap presented itself, and listened to the sounds of the federal processing happening in the rest of the building. Footsteps mostly. The particular cadence of people moving with purpose through a space that had until a few hours ago that belonged to other people. Voices low and professional, the occasional sound of a filing cabinet drawer. At one point, something heavy being moved across the floor in the evidence room down the hall. Deputy Carla Metz came into the break room at 4:40 stopped when she saw Nora, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Metz was 43 solid, with the kind of face that had seen enough of the job to stop performing surprise at things. She'd been one of the officers sitting in the bullpen when Paulson brought Nora in, and she'd been the one who had said nothing when Kell told everyone to stay where they were. Not compliance, exactly. More like someone who recognized an irreversible situation and chose not to make it worse. "You want coffee?" Nora asked. Metz looked at the coffee maker, looked at Nora, looked at the coffee maker again. "Sure." Nora got up and started it. She knew where everything was in this break room, had been in it a dozen times during the community liaison meetings, and Metz sat down at the table with the careful movements of someone whose knees hurt. "How long?" Metz asked. 14 months, Metz absorbed that. The whole time. "Yes." "The liaison meetings?"
"Yes."
Metz put both hands flat on the table. "Were you ever actually, were the patients at Vallon General?" "Real patients," Nora said. "Real care. I'm a licensed nurse." Placement was real. She paused. The observation was also real. Coffee maker made its familiar series of sounds, and the break room filled with the smell of coffee, which was better than the burnt smell that had been there when Nora arrived. Metz stared at the table. "Braddock," she said. It wasn't a question. Among others, I knew something was off. Foss especially. There were budget reconciliation meetings that I was deliberately excluded from. Patrol assignments that got changed at the last minute without explanation. Metz looked up. "I filed 2 internal complaints. Nothing came of them." "I know," Nora said. "Your complaints are in the DOJ file. They're part of the documentation of the suppression structure." Something in Metz's face shifted, not relief exactly, more like the specific sensation of having carried something for a long time and discovering that its weight had been recorded, that someone had noticed. "What happens to the department?" Nora poured coffee into a mug and set it in front of her. "Federal oversight, at minimum. That's the immediate consequence. Everything else depends on what the investigation develops." She poured her own cup. "You're not on the list, Deputy." "I know," Metz said. "Checked when Kell showed it to me." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Paulson's not on it either. No, he's an idiot," Metz said. "Not with venom. Just as a statement of fact, the way you describe a weather condition. He's an idiot who thought he was in a department where being an idiot was fine because everyone above him was worse." She drank her coffee. "That's not an excuse." "No," Nora agreed, "it's not." They sat with that for a moment, the both of them in the break room that smelled like coffee and old linoleum, and outside the window the sky was getting lighter in the slow, uncommitted way that November mornings come in Harlow County. The forensics team finished their initial pass through Foss's envelopes at 5:17 M and the lead technician, a woman named Priya, whose last name was on a lanyard, Nora couldn't read from across the room, brought the preliminary inventory to Caldwell in the watch commander's office. Nora was there by then, her phone at 31%, the granola bar a distant memory. She watched Caldwell read the inventory sheet without expression. 8 envelopes, Priya said. The content breaks down as follows. Payment records. Handwritten, using an internal coding system will need the decryption key or a patterns analyst to crack the recipient codes, but initial assessment suggests at least 12 distinct coded recipients. Surveillance photographs, interior, all taken within the substation. We've identified the watch commander's personal camera equipment consistent with the images. 2 photographs were taken outside the department, one at a location we haven't identified yet, and one that appears to be the county administration building. She paused. And there's a separate envelope inside the bottom envelope. Sealed, different wax than the others. Caldwell looked up. Different wax. Different color. The others are red. One is black. The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at the sealed envelope, which was sitting separately on the corner of the desk, untouched. Has anyone opened it? Caldwell asked. No. We photographed it in place before removal, documented the seal integrity, chain of custody is clean. Priya paused. We wanted you to see it first. Caldwell looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. Any red on this? Black wax is sometimes used for higher-level correspondence and personal documentation, she said carefully. It's not standard. If Foss was using color coding. The red ones are internal, Caldwell said. The black one is external. It's my reading. He pulled on a pair of gloves and picked up the envelope. It was smaller than the others, not a standard letter size, but something closer to a personal note card envelope. Thick. The kind of stationery that costs money. Turned it over. No printed return address, no postage. Hand-delivered or kept internal. The wax seal was pressed with something round and smooth, not a monogram, not a signet, just a smooth circle. The kind you make when you have nothing to press with and you use the flat end of a pen cap. He opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a USB drive. He read the sheet first. His face changed in a way that Nora had not seen it change in the previous 6 hours of processing. Not alarmed, not surprised, but the specific controlled expression of someone who has just confirmed something they had hoped they were wrong about. He set the sheet down. He held up the USB drive. "Get me a secure laptop," he said to Priya. "It'll take a few minutes." "Get it." Priya left. Nora looked at the sheet of paper on the desk. Caldwell didn't stop her from reading it. It was short. 14 lines, handwritten, in a cramped, upright script that was Foss's. She'd seen his handwriting on department paperwork during the liaison meetings, and it was distinctive, the letters too vertical, like they were trying to stand at attention. Content was not a confession. It was not an explanation. A list of dates and names and amounts, organized in a table, and at the bottom, a single sentence that was not part of the table. "If anything happens to me, the drive goes to the U.S. Attorney's office, not local." He prepared this for someone, Nora said. Or for himself, Caldwell said. "Insurance, like you said. The U.S. Attorney specifically, not federal, not DOJ, not Marshals. U.S. Attorney." Caldwell looked at her, which means he knew the DOJ investigation existed. The implication sat between them for a moment, neither of them saying the next part out loud, because saying it out loud changed what the next 3 hours would look like. If Foss had known the DOJ investigation existed, someone had told him. Someone with access to DOJ operational intelligence, which meant the investigation might have a leak not in the substation, not at the local level, but somewhere upstream, somewhere that had access to the case file. Nora thought about Solis's instruction from 40 minutes ago, don't share anything on Greer with Caldwell yet. The time she'd accepted it as jurisdictional caution. Now she was looking at it from a different angle, and the different angle was uncomfortable. Kept her face neutral. "Let's see what's on the drive." Cure laptop arrived at 5:44 a.m. Priya plugged in the USB drive under Caldwell's supervision and ran an initial integrity check clean, no malware, no encryption, and opened the file directory. 3 folders. The first was labeled Payments, the second Photographs, and the third, which was by far the largest in file size, was labeled with a single letter G. Nobody in the room said anything about that. Caldwell opened G first. Took the laptop a moment to process the folder, and in that moment the break room had the particular quality of a spaces where several people are holding their breath without coordinating it. Then the files opened, and what was on the screen was not what any of them had expected, not photographs, not financial records, but audio files. 47 of them, organized by date. The earliest dated back 26 months. The most recent was recorded 9 days ago. Foss had been recording conversations. Caldwell clicked the most recent file. It opened with a brief burst of ambient noise, what sounded like a car interior, engine running, and then 2 voices. One was Foss, the other was male, measured with the particular cadence of a man who has spent decades giving orders in rooms where he expected them to be followed. The voice said, "The DOJ is closer than Braddock thinks. The hospital documentation gets pulled before March. The Halcyon payments become traceable. I need that window." Foss's voice said, "I can stall the internal audit until February. After that, it's out of my hands." "February is fine," the other voice said. "Make sure the nurse rotation logs don't leave the floor supervisor's office." The file ended there, just over 2 minutes long, clipped mid-conversation, as if Foss had turned the recorder off when things got too specific. The room was completely silent. Caldwell closed the laptop, turned to Priya. "This drive doesn't leave your custody. Not mine, not the Marshal team's, not anyone else's. Yours until I tell you otherwise." He looked at the forensics technician who had come in with Priya. "Same for you. Nothing about the audio files gets communicated through the department relay system. Personal phones only, and only to me directly." Priya nodded, her expression carefully professional. Caldwell looked at Nora. "Step outside with me." They went out through the substation's side door, into the narrow concrete walkway, between the building and the chain-link fence that bordered the property. Cold. The sky was fully light now, a flat gray that promised nothing in particular. Caldwell put his hands in his pockets and looked at the fence. "The other voice," he said. "I know," she said. "You've heard it before." She had. Not in person, in a recording that had come to her through DOJ secure channels 8 months ago. A wiretapped phone call between a Halcyon construction executive and an unidentified county official that the patterns team had flagged as high value, but had never been able to source definitively. Cadence of the voice, the specific phrasing, the rhythm of the pauses. She had listened to that recording 30 times over 3 months, trying to match it to names in the file. She hadn't been able to. Not then. But that was 8 months ago, and she'd heard more voices since. "It's Greer," she said. "County Executive Harlan Greer." Caldwell looked at her. His expression was not surprise. It was the look of someone who has just had a suspicion, confirmed that they would have preferred to remain a suspicion. "How long have you had that?" "The name surfaced in the last hour. The voice match is new." She paused. "I was told to hold it internally until 6 a.m. pending jurisdictional coverage confirmation." "Who told you that?" "Chain of command." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He was a careful man by training and experience, and careful men do not like it when they discover that the information environment around an operation has been managed without their knowledge. "Jurisdictional coverage isn't the issue here," he said. "If Greer is on that audio, and Greer is a named party, we have coverage." "We have more than coverage, I know." "Then why?" "Because Nora said," and she kept her voice steady, "whoever told me to hold it knew the name before I gave it to them." Stopped him. She let it sit for 3 seconds. "I gave Deputy Director Solis the name at approximately 4:15 a.m. She did not react with surprise. She reacted with silence, which is what Solis does when she already knows something and is deciding what to do with it. Me to repeat the name, which she does when she's buying time. Nora looked at the fence. "I've worked with Mar and Solis for 9 years. I know her reactions." Caldwell said nothing for a long moment. The cold air moved between them, and somewhere beyond the fence a bird started up and then stopped. "You're telling me you think your supervisor already knew about Greer?" "I'm telling you it's possible, and she told you to sit on it." Until 6 a.m. Caldwell checked his watch. "It's 5:51. "Yes." He looked at the side door of the substation. "The audio files. If Solis knew about Greer and he's on the audio, she may be managing how that becomes part of the official record." Nora said it plainly. Without accusation, because accusation wasn't useful at 5:51 a.m. in a cold concrete walkway. "I'm not saying she's protecting him. I'm saying that at this level, things get complicated in ways that don't always look like corruption. Sometimes they look like jurisdictional management. Sometimes they look like protecting a larger operation that you don't have full visibility into. And sometimes they look like corruption," Caldwell said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" It was an interesting question. He'd asked it straight, without framing it as his decision or hers, which she appreciated. "The drive's content needs to go into the official record through a channel that doesn't run through Solis's office," she said. "Not to circumvent the DOJ, to protect the evidence integrity in case the chain becomes contested later." "The U.S. Attorney," Caldwell said, like Foss's note said. Foss had the same instinct, which suggests he knew the DOJ line had exposure. Caldwell pulled out his personal phone, not the department relay, not the federal comm system, his personal phone, and looked at it for a moment. "I have a direct line to the U.S. Attorney's office in this district. I've never used it for anything active. Now might be the time." He dialed. It rang 5 times. It was not yet 6 in the morning, and then went to voicemail. He left a message that was professionally worded and completely clear in its urgency. "This is Agent Marcus Caldwell, Josie D. Calling regarding evidence recovered during Operation Clean Sweep at Harlow County Substation 7. I have time-sensitive material that requires direct attorney review outside existing case channels. Please call this number as soon as possible." He ended the call and put his phone back in his pocket. 5:58 a.m. Nora's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. "Solis." She answered it. "Vass, it's 6, Solis said. "Status. Processing is ongoing. The envelopes contain payment records and surveillance photographs, as I indicated." Nora kept her voice even. "There's also audio recording material." A pause. "Audio. 47 files. Conversations. Dating back 26 months. She watched Caldwell watching her. "The most recent file contains a voice I believe I can identify." The silence on Solis's end lasted longer than before. "Nora, I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I always listen carefully. The Greer connection is part of a larger ongoing federal operation that runs parallel to what you've been working on. If you move on that audio without coordination, you risk compromising." "Deputy Director," Nora said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite hard, but wasn't soft either, the voice of someone who has just finished deciding something. Foss's note specifically directs the drive content to the U.S. Attorney's office. That instruction is part of the documented evidence chain. Agent Caldwell is the senior federal officer on scene. The appropriate step is to follow the documented direction of the evidence itself. Another silence. This one had a different quality. "You've already called the U.S. Attorney," Solis said. "Agent Caldwell has." Nora looked at Caldwell. As the senior officer on scene, he made the determination. Solis said nothing for 4 seconds. Then I'll need a full debrief in person. Today. I'm available after the scene is secured. Call ended. Caldwell raised an eyebrow at her. She knows, Nora said, about the audio, about Greer. Probably has known for weeks. Is she protecting the investigation or protecting him? I don't know yet. She put her phone in her pocket. But I know that answer is going to matter more than anything else we found in those envelopes. Caldwell's personal phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and answered immediately. He listened for approximately 90 seconds, said yes 3 times and nothing else, and ended the call. He looked at Nora U.S. Attorney's offices, sending a team. 2 hours. Who's the AUSA? Kathleen Morrow. Nora felt something shift in the calculation. She'd been running since 4:15 a.m. Kathleen Morrow was not a name she knew personally, but it was a name she had seen in the case file once, in a footnote, in a document she had read 9 months ago and hadn't been able to place in context until now. Morrow's name had appeared in an internal DOJ communication as a contact for a separate federal inquiry into Harlow County's municipal finances. An inquiry that had been opened, and then, according to the file, quietly closed 6 months ago, pending additional review. The inquiry that had been quietly closed, around the same time that the Patterns team had flagged the wiretapped call with the unidentified county official, around the same time that Nora had listened to that recording 30 times and hadn't been able to make the match. She thought about what it meant that Kathleen Morrow's separate inquiry had been closed at the same moment the voiced tape had gone unidentified. She thought about coincidences and how often they turned out not to be. She thought about Salise's silence on the phone and what kind of silence it was, and whether the parallel operation Salise had mentioned was designed to protect the investigation or to protect something else entirely. 2 hours. Morrow's team would arrive in 2 hours. And somewhere in Harlow County, Harlan Greer was waking up to a Tuesday morning, and he did not yet know what was sitting on a laptop in his substation's watch commander's office. But inside the substation, in interview room B, Derek Paulson had just said something to the junior marshal, who'd been sitting with him while Caldwell was outside, something that the marshal immediately wrote down and immediately flagged. And the marshal came out of the interview room and crossed the bullpen and found Caldwell in the doorway from the side entrance and said quietly, "Sir, Paulson says he knows where Foss went last night." Caldwell looked at the marshal for exactly 1 second before he turned and walked back into interview room B. Paulson was sitting where he'd been for the past 2 hours, but something about his posture had changed the particular collapse of a man who has spent the last hour deciding whether the thing he knows is worth the cost of saying it, and has finally decided that the cost of not saying it is higher. He had his elbows on the table and his hands folded in front of him, and he looked up when Caldwell came in without the defensive reflex he'd had at the beginning of the night. "Tell me about Foss," Caldwell said, sitting down. "Called in sick at 6 p.m. I know because I was in the lot when he drove out. He didn't look sick. He had a bag in the back seat, not a duffel, like a proper travel bag, the kind with wheels." Paulson stopped. "He waved at me. Foss never waves. Where does he go? When he needs to be somewhere nobody checks." Paulson looked at the table. "There's a property. Out on Route 9, past the Millhaven Junction. Old farm, been in disuse for 20 years. County owns the land technically, but the structures are grandfathered under a commercial holding that Foss set up through a shell entity about 8 years ago. I drove past it once on a call. Saw Foss's personal truck there, not his department vehicle. I didn't ask." "You didn't ask," Caldwell repeated. "I knew better than to ask." Paulson's voice had gone flat, not defensive. Just honest in the way that people get honest when they've accepted the shape of what they did. That's the whole thing, isn't it? You get to a point where you know better than to ask, and you stop asking, and then one day asking would have mattered, and you've already got the habit of not doing it. Caldwell wrote down Route 9, Millhaven Junction. "Is there anything on the property besides the farm structures?" "There's a basement. I saw the exterior access when I drove past double cellar doors, padlocked. That's not standard for agricultural storage. It's climate controlled, or it was being built that way. I could see PVC conduit running along the exterior foundation." He paused. "And there was a satellite dish on the roof of the main structure that was too new for everything else out there." Caldwell stood up. He looked at Paulson for a moment. "You're going to write all of that down? Address, physical description, everything you remember. The marshal outside will give you paper." He moved toward the door. "Is it going to matter?" Paulson asked. "Me telling you this." Caldwell stopped, but didn't turn around. "It's going to matter to the case. Not what I asked." Caldwell didn't answer that one. He went out. Nora was at the break room table with a second cup of coffee when Caldwell found her. He dropped the notepad page on the table in front of her Route 9. Millhaven, his own handwriting, not Paulson's yet. Farm property. Foss's off-book. He drove there last night before the raid. She read the note. Climate-controlled basement. Satellite communication. That's Paulson's description from a drive past 8 years ago. Could have changed. Or it could have been upgraded. She looked at the note. If Foss knew the DOJ investigation was getting close, he wouldn't run without taking whatever he needed from the property first. The audio recordings in the envelopes were copies, she said, or backups. A man who records 47 conversations over 26 months doesn't keep his own copies in a filing cabinet under his desk at the substation. She set down her coffee. The real archive is wherever he went last night. Caldwell looked at her. You want to go to the property? I want a Marshal team to go to the property. Foss has been running coercion inside the department for years. If he's on that property, and he has a full archive audio, payment records, photographs, and he decides to destroy it before we get there, then everything we have on Greer becomes one audio file on a USB drive, Caldwell said, which Greer's attorneys will spend 2 years contesting. Yes. He was already pulling out his personal phone. He dialed, spoke briefly to the Marshal team lead in the parking lot, and came back. They need 30 minutes to reconfigure for a rural approach. Property location needs to be confirmed against county records before they move. Can confirm it, she said. I have county property database access through my DOJ credentials. Take 5 minutes. She pulled out her laptop from the tote bag, a slim, unremarkable device that looked like every other cheap work laptop, which was the point, and opened the county property records portal. She typed in the Route 9 parameters in Millhaven Junction as a proximity reference and ran the search. Came back in 40 seconds. The property was listed under a holding company called Nora Vass Agricultural LLC. Registered agent was a law firm in the county seat. Annual taxes paid on time every year for the past 18 years. The structures on the property were listed as agricultural outbuildings, with a total assessed value that was deliberately, carefully low, the kind of assessment that happens when someone knows exactly how to describe improvements in a way that doesn't trigger revaluation. But the square footage of the listed structures didn't match the satellite imagery. Nora pulled the most recent county aerial survey 3 years old, but useful, and overlaid it against the property assessment. The main structure on the assessment was listed at 1,800 square feet. The footprint on the aerial was closer to 2,600. 800 square feet of unlisted space. He built onto it, she said. Unpermitted addition. The 800 square feet isn't in the county records. Caldwell leaned over and looked at the screen. That's the basement. That's where the basement expanded. She traced the footprint on the screen. The original structure has a visible roofline in the aerial. The addition is lower, partially below grade. You can see the roofline break here, she pointed. He dug out and expanded. Whatever's down there is bigger than a root cellar. Caldwell straightened up. I'll get the team moving. The Marshal team left the substation at 6:22 a.m. 4 vehicles, plain, running quiet without lights, which was the right call for a rural approach, on a property that might have perimeter surveillance. Caldwell rode in the lead vehicle. Nora rode in the second, which she hadn't planned on, and which Caldwell hadn't exactly invited, but also hadn't stopped when she got in. Route 9 east of the substation was a 2-lane county road that ran through intermittent tree cover and flat agricultural land, and at 6:22 in the morning it was completely empty. The light was gray and flat, no sun yet through the cloud cover, and the fields on either side of the road were dead November brown, waiting for winter. The Marshal driving the second vehicle, a compact woman named Torres, who hadn't said anything since they'd left the parking lot, took the turns at a pace that was fast but controlled, kind of driving that professionals do when they need to be somewhere quickly without announcing it. Nora sat in the back and watched the road through the windshield and went through the case architecture in her head, the way she always did before an approach, not visualizing outcomes, which was a waste of time, but mapping contingencies. If Foss was on the property and cooperative, the archive was accessible, and the evidentiary chain was clean. Foss was on the property and not cooperative. They had a warrant situation and a negotiation situation, and an unpredictable variable inside a structure they didn't have schematics for. If Foss was not on the property, they had whatever he'd left behind, which might be nothing, might be everything, and might be rigged in some way, not explosives. She didn't think Foss was that kind of person. But wiped drives, destroyed records, a fire set on a timer. Men who kept insurance records for 26 months don't blow them up on impulse, but men who know a federal raid happened while they were already running do impulsive things. And if the archive included what she thought it included, audio records of Harlan Greer directing evidence suppression, Financial records of payments routed through Halcyon to county officials. Then the question of who else knew about it became urgent. Celise had told her to hold the Greer connection. Celise had reacted to the name without surprise. In the parallel federal operation, Celise had mentioned the one that supposedly ran alongside Nora's placement had never appeared in any briefing document Nora had received in 14 months of fieldwork. Parallel operations existed. They were legitimate, but they were also occasionally a way of managing evidence that inconvenienced people who were being managed rather than investigated. Torres said from the front seat, Millhaven Junction in 2 minutes. Nora put the contingencies away and watched the road. The farm property sat back from Route 9 behind a rusted gate that was not, technically, locked. The chain was looped through the latch twice, but the padlock was open, hanging on the chain link without engaging. Either someone had left in a hurry and not locked it properly, or someone had unlocked it recently and not bothered to relock it. The Marshal team lead, a broad-shouldered man named Erickson, who had said exactly 12 words since Nora had gotten in the vehicle at the substation, got out and checked the chain without touching the lock. He signaled twice recent handling, unknown status, and the team spread into a perimeter approach pattern, 2 vehicles staying at the gate and 2 moving up the access road at walking pace with personnel on foot alongside. Nora stayed between Torres and another Marshal named Wicks, who was tall and moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been on rural approaches before and knew that hurrying on uneven ground in the dark was how people got hurt. Access road was gravel, badly maintained, with ruts that had frozen overnight and were only beginning to soften in the morning cold. The main structure was visible from the gate, a long, low building with board and batten siding that had once been painted red and was now a weathered pink-gray, the color of old barnwood in the particular way that Harlow County barns went. The satellite dish Paulson had described was there, mounted on the south-facing peak, and it was not a residential dish. Directional, professional grade, aimed with specificity. Someone had been communicating from this location with regularity and intent. The approach confirmed 2 things quickly. The main structure's windows were dark, and there was no vehicle on the property. Whatever Gerald Foss had loaded into his travel bag and driven away from the substation at 6 p. Yesterday he had come here and then left. Erickson signaled the breach team forward. They went through the main structure in 4 minutes, every room, every closet, the attic access, the crawl space under the eastern addition. Empty. Not abandoned empty, but recently vacated empty, a coffee cup on the counter with residue that hadn't fully dried, a folded blanket on the main room couch with the impressions still in it, a wastebasket near the communications equipment that had been emptied but not wiped down. Erickson looked at Nora from across the main room. She pointed at the floor. There was a rug in the center of the room, industrial, rubber-backed, the kind you'd put over a concrete floor for warmth, that sat at a slightly wrong angle. Not the angle of a rug that someone had placed carelessly. The angle of a rug that had been moved and replaced in a hurry. Wicks lifted the rug. Underneath, a floor hatch, steel-framed, flush set, with a handle recessed into the surface. And next to the handle, a combination lock. The lock was a 4-digit mechanical combination, the kind that forensic teams can open in under 3 minutes with the right equipment, and the equipment arrived from the second vehicle in exactly that time. While the lock was being worked, Nora examined the communications setup in the main room. A laptop dock, no laptop, a multiband radio transceiver, powered down, and a rack-mounted external hard drive array that had been powered down and partially disassembled. 2 of the 4 drive bays were empty, the drives physically removed. 2 bays still had drives in them, which was either because Foss had run out of time or because whatever was on those drives was too large to carry, and he'd chosen other copies. Nora put on gloves and looked at the remaining drives without touching them. The model numbers were visible on the labels. High capacity, server grade, kind you use for long-term audio and video storage. She looked at the empty bays. 2 drives removed. The remaining 2 left. A man running under pressure makes decisions based on what he can carry and what he can't replace. The drives were mirrored standard practice for an archive, this important, then the ones he took were the primary copies and the ones he left were the backups. Which meant the full archive might still be here, sitting in 2 drives he'd decided were expendable because he had their content elsewhere. Or he'd taken the primary copies and left the backups, and the backup copies were sufficient for evidentiary purposes. Either way, what was left in those drive bays mattered. The lock opened at 6:51 a.m. The hatch led down a steel ladder into a space that was, as Nora had estimated from the aerial imagery, approximately 800 square feet of climate-controlled below-grade construction. Temperature was consistent around 62 degrees, maintained by a separate HVAC unit that was still running, humming steadily in the corner. The lighting was fluorescent and came on automatically when the hatch opened. And the space was not empty. One section held additional communications equipment, more sophisticated than what was upstairs encryption hardware, signal routers, equipment that Nora recognized from her time in the classified military unit and that did not belong in the possession of a county lieutenant. One section held a set of steel shelving units with labeled banker's boxes, organized by year going back 12 years. And along the far wall, a workstation with 3 monitors, all currently dark, connected to a server rack that was still powered on the drive indicator lights, blinking steadily green. The server rack was not disconnected. Foss had taken the portable drives from upstairs, but he had not shut down the server, which meant either he'd panicked and left without realizing it, or he'd left it running deliberately, which suggested remote access, the ability to wipe the server from wherever he'd gone without being physically present. "Don't touch the network connection," Nora said immediately. She was looking at the server rack from the base of the ladder. If he has remote access, any activity on the network might trigger an automatic wipe. Erickson, who had come down behind her, stopped moving. "How do we pull the data without air gap?" she said. "We physically disconnect the network interface first. The data stays on the server. No external signal can trigger a wipe, and then the forensics team can clone the drives directly." She looked at the server rack. "The network card will be in the rear panel. One connector, probably RJ45. You can do that without corrupting what's on it? The server's not actively writing, yes. The drives are in a steady state. They're not recording anything right now. They're just powered." She moved towards the rack, carefully stepping around a section of flooring that had an extension cable running across it. "I need someone on the ladder watching for any change in those indicator lights. If anything starts blinking differently, call it immediately." Wicks went to the base of the ladder and angled to see the front of the rack. Nora went around to the rear panel. The network interface card was where she expected it. Server hardware is standardized, and this was a commercial server with commercial architecture, nothing exotic. She found the RJ45 connector and removed it cleanly, a single pull, no force required. "Any change?" she called. "Nothing," Wicks said. "Still steady green." Exhaled. The drive indicator lights continued their steady pulse. The network was disconnected. The server was isolated. She came back around the front of the rack and looked at the indicator panel. 12 drives, all showing green. The total storage capacity based on the drive model indicators was somewhere around 48 terabytes. 48 terabytes of whatever Gerald Foss had been recording, storing, and filing for at least 12 years. Erickson called Caldwell at 7 Fowray m while the forensics team was being redirected from the substation to the farm property. Caldwell was in the lead vehicle. At the gate, he'd stayed perimeter during the approach, which was the tactically correct decision for the senior agent, and also, Nora suspected, conscious choice to let the Marshal team work without federal oversight hovering over their shoulders. He arrived at the main structure at 7:11, came down the ladder, and stood at the base of it looking at the server rack and the shelving units and the communications equipment for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, 12 years, at least Nora said. The banker's boxes go back 12. The server archive may go further. This isn't just coercion material. He was looking at the shelving units. This is a comprehensive operational record. For someone. She looked at him. Foss wasn't running this infrastructure for himself. The encryption hardware alone, that's beyond what a county lieutenant builds for personal insurance. Someone was funding this. Someone needed a secure information operation inside Harlow County law enforcement, and Foss was running it. Caldwell looked at her. Greer. Or whoever's above Greer. She said it carefully, because careful was still what the situation required. The 47 audio files we found in the envelope upstairs, those were Foss's personal insurance copies. Whatever's on this server is the operational archive. Complete record. And if the complete record goes further up the chain than Greer minus, then we're not looking at a county corruption case. She watched him process that. We're looking at a structured intelligence operation inside a law enforcement agency, and we have 48 terabytes of its archive sitting in a climate-controlled basement in Harlow County. The sound of vehicles on the gravel access road reached them from above the forensics team arriving. Caldwell looked up at the hatch and then back at the server rack. "I'm going to need to make some calls." "There's something you should do first," Nora said. He looked at her, the banker's boxes. She pointed at the shelving units. The most recent one. "Before the forensics team catalogs everything, I think you should look at what's in the most recent box." He looked at the shelf. The boxes were labeled by year neatly in the same upright, cramped handwriting as Foss's note. The most recent one was on the top shelf, this year's label. Caldwell pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, lifted the box down, and opened it on the workstation surface. Inside, manila folders organized by month. He opened the most recent month. The first folder contained printed transcripts, audio transcripts, time-stamped, matching the format of the recording files they'd found on the USB drive upstairs. But these were longer, more complete. The USB file they'd listened to at the substation was 2 minutes and 12 seconds. Transcript in this folder, from the same date, ran to 11 pages. 11 pages of conversation that the USB file had cut off after 2 minutes. Caldwell started reading. His face, which had been controlled and professional for the last 2 hours, did something he couldn't fully prevent: a tightening around the eyes, a slight change in the set of his mouth. He read 4 pages, then looked up. "Kathleen Morrow," he said. "She's in there?" "She's in the transcript. The conversation we heard the beginning of on the USB, it doesn't end with Greer and Foss discussing the hospital documentation." He turned the folder so Nora could see the page. "It ends with a third voice." Nora read the transcript. The third voice entered on page 7, identified in Foss's notation system as KM. The conversation shifted when it entered. Greer's tone changed, became more careful, the cadence of a man who deferred to whoever he was speaking to. The third voice gave specific instructions about the timeline for closing the municipal finance inquiry, about which documents should be classified and which should be transferred to an inactive case file, about what Morrow's office would find when it opened the review and what it would not. Kathleen Morrow, Assistant United States Attorney. Team was arriving at the Harlow substation in less than an hour. Nora looked at Caldwell. "She's not coming to help." "No," he said. "She's coming to manage what we found." Close the folder. He put it back in the box. He put the box back on the shelf, in its exact position, and looked at the hatch above them. The forensics team was moving equipment through the main structure. She could hear the footsteps, the controlled voices, the sound of cases being opened. "The U.S. Attorney," Caldwell said. "Not Morrow. The U. Attorney directly, yes. That call I made this morning went to the main line. Morrow's office routes the incoming messages. She'd have heard your voicemail before she called you back." Nora looked at him. "Which means she knew about the farm property before she confirmed she was coming." Caldwell stared at the server rack for a moment. The drive lights blinked their steady green. 48 terabytes of material that, if they were right about what it contained, had just made this case too large for its own jurisdiction, too dangerous for its own chain of command, and pointed at a level of institutional compromise that neither of them had walked into this operation, expecting to find at the bottom of a farm basement in Harlow County. "I need a secure line that doesn't go through any existing case channel," he said. "Nothing DOJ, nothing U.S. Attorney, nothing Marshal relay." "FBI," Nora said. He looked at her. "I'd need to call someone I trust personally, not through the Bureau's main intake. Do you have someone?" Quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Then call them." She looked at the hatch. "And do it before Morrow's team gets here." He took out his personal phone and walked to the far end of the basement, away from the hatch and the sound of the forensics team above, and dialed a number from memory. Stood with his back to the room and spoke in a voice too low for Nora to hear. Turned and looked at the shelving units. 12 years of boxes. 12 years of transcripts and photographs and payment records and surveillance material, organized by a county lieutenant into a climate-controlled archive beneath a farm property on Route 9, Harlow County. She thought about all the people those folders represented: the officers who'd been coerced, the civilians who'd had cases manipulated against them, the witnesses whose testimonies had been shaped or buried, the money that had moved through Halcyon's accounts and come out the other side as influence and protection and silence. She had spent 14 months in this county, performing ordinary and watching for the edges of it. She had been stopped on a road for a broken taillight and dragged into a substation in handcuffs by a man who had never once considered that she might be the most dangerous person in the room. She was thinking about that, about the wait of 14 months, and what they had finally uncovered, when Caldwell came back across the basement. His face set in a way that told her the call had gone the direction it needed to go, but that it wasn't going to make the next few hours simple. "FBI sending their own team," he said. "ETA 90 minutes. Morrow arrives in 40, I know." He looked at the hatch. "When she gets here, she cannot know about the server. She'll get the substation evidence, the envelopes, the USB, the standard documentation. The farm property gets treated as ongoing active scene, access restricted to forensics personnel. She'll push back on that. Let her push back. She's the AUSA on a warrant that covers the department and Halcyon. The farm property is outside that warrant's geographic scope. He looked at her. Defensible for 40 minutes. And when the FBI team gets here, then it becomes their scene, and Morrow's jurisdictional claim evaporates. He held her gaze. Can you hold for 40 minutes? Nora had held things together for 14 months in a county that was more comprehensively rotten than anyone had realized. 40 minutes was not the problem. Yes, she said. They went up the ladder. Kathleen Morrow arrived at the Harlow substation at 7:38 a.m. in a black DOJ vehicle with 2 attorneys and a paralegal, all of them in suits, all of them carrying briefcases. She was 51 slight, with silver-streaked hair cut close, and the polished authority of someone who had built a career on being the most prepared person in any room she entered. She shook Caldwell's hand in the parking lot and said, "Good work getting the raid moved up. I understand the warrant activation was accidental. Officer Paulson destroyed the seal during a traffic stop," Caldwell said. "And the nurse? The undercover placement?" She said it with the professional neutrality of someone who knows the answers and is asking for the record. Investigator Vass. She's been on scene since the arrest. Morrow looked around the parking lot, at the armored Marshal vehicles, the forensics van, the activity in and out of the substation door. Where is she now? Processing documentation with the forensics team, Caldwell said, which was technically true. Nora was at the substation, reviewing the USB drive contents with Priya while the farm property forensics team worked Route 9. I'd like to speak with her, of course. Shall we start with the evidence inventory? Morrow looked at him for a fraction of a second, a short look, the kind that experienced people use to take a reading, and then said, yes. Start there. They went inside. Nora was in the break room when Caldwell brought Morrow through the substation. She looked up, made brief eye contact with Caldwell across the hallway, a single look that said 40 minutes, hold, and went back to the documents in front of her. Morrow's gaze moved across her without stopping, which told Nora something. Morrow wasn't going to acknowledge her immediately, which meant Morrow was managing optics in the particular way that people manage optics when they're performing a role rather than serving a function. In the watch commander's office, Caldwell walked Morrow through the evidence inventory, the 8 envelopes, the USB drive, the payment records, the photographs. He described the contents with precision and accuracy, presenting everything the warrant scope covered, everything that fell within the documented investigation into the department and Halcyon Construction. He did not mention the audio file on the USB drive that named a third voice alongside Greer's. He presented the USB as payment and surveillance documentation. He did not mention the farm property. Morrow reviewed the inventory with the focused attention of someone doing due diligence, and she asked careful questions, the kind of careful questions that are designed to establish what exists within the documented record, is different from asking what exists generally. The envelopes contain payment records and photographs, she said. No additional media. No additional media in the envelopes, Caldwell said, which was true. And the USB drive, has it been fully inventoried? Being processed by our forensics lead. I'll want a copy of the drive image when it's ready. Of course. Morrow closed her briefcase. There were reports of a rural property flagged during the overnight processing. Route 9. Caldwell looked at her with an expression that was entirely neutral. Where are you getting that? It came through the relay system. One of the overnight deputies mentioned it in his interview log. Caldwell made a note on his pad. The interview logs were marked as internal processing documents pending review. They came through the relay, Morrow said, which runs through my office's monitoring system for active cases. She held his gaze with the steady patience of someone who has been in rooms like this before and is not going to be moved by careful phrasing. Is there a rural property relevant to this investigation, Agent Caldwell? The moment stretched. Outside in the parking lot, a vehicle pulled in. Then another. Caldwell looked at his watch. It was 7:59 a.m. He looked up at Morrow. I think you should come outside. She held the look for one more second. Then she turned and walked out of the watch commander's office, through the bullpen, through the front door of the substation, into the parking lot. 2 FBI vehicles had pulled in alongside the existing federal fleet. And standing next to the lead vehicle, in a dark jacket with an FBI credential case open in his hand, was a man named Special Agent Darren Okafor of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, whose name was on none of the documents connected to this investigation, and who was looking at Kathleen Morrow with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for this specific moment. Morrow stopped walking. Okafor said, Kathleen. She said nothing. We need to talk about the Harlan Greer recordings, Okafor said, and we need to talk about the Millhaven property. He looked at her for a moment, and we need to talk about the third voice in the transcript. Behind Morrow, in the doorway of the substation, Nora Vass stood in her blue hospital scrubs and watched Kathleen Morrow's composed expression do something it had probably not done in a very long time. Break apart, quietly, at the seams, in the particular way that happens when someone who has spent years being the most prepared person in the room finally encounters a room they had not prepared for. Morrow turned. She looked at Nora, really looked, for the first time, the professional neutrality completely gone. "You," she said. Nora said nothing. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Nora said. "But honestly, the transcript in the box confirmed it 30 minutes ago." Morrow looked at Okafor. She looked at Caldwell. She looked at the FBI vehicles in the parking lot, at the agents stepping out of them, the forensics van that had now been redirected and was already moving toward Route 9 with a fresh team aboard. She looked at the broken wax seal from the original warrant, which someone had placed in a clear evidence bag and which was sitting on the booking desk through the open door behind Nora, visible from the parking lot in the morning light. She said to Okafor, in a voice that had most of the air taken out of it, "I want my attorney." Okafor nodded. "That's your right." He looked at the two attorneys she'd brought from her own office, who were standing by the DOJ vehicle, looking at each other with the specific expression of people who have just realized they came to the wrong meeting. "I'd suggest calling someone other than the people you arrived with." And somewhere on Route 9, at the bottom of a steel ladder in a climate-controlled basement, the server rack's drive indicator lights continued their steady green pulse, blinking patiently in the dark, 48 terabytes of organized testimony, waiting for the right hands to open it. Two attorneys from Morrow's office got back in the DOJ vehicle within 4 minutes of Okafor's instruction. Not because anyone told them to leave, Okafor hadn't said that, but because experienced attorneys in expensive suits recognize the shape of a situation that has turned against everyone who arrived in their car, and self-preservation is a cleaner instinct than loyalty, when loyalty stops being professionally viable. Paralegal followed them. The doors closed. The vehicle didn't move, because nobody had told them they could leave, but the closing of the doors was its own kind of statement. Morrow stood in the parking lot with her briefcase, still in her hand, and called her personal attorney from her personal phone. Okafor led her. He stood nearby without hovering close enough to monitor, far enough to give the appearance of professional courtesy, and while Morrow made her call, he walked Caldwell 20 feet toward the substation door and spoke quietly. The third voice in the transcript, Okafor said, "We've had a file on Morrow for 16 months. Caldwell looked at him. 16 months. Parallel track. Not connected to the DOJ placement, separate FBI public corruption inquiry. Morrow's been managing the Harlow County municipal finance cases through her office in a way that patterns analysts flagged as statistically anomalous. Case closure rates, reclassification decisions, the timing of inquiries relative to Halcyon's contract awards." He glanced at Morrow, who had turned away to take her call. "We didn't have audio. We had patterns. And now you have audio. Now we have 47 files and a 48-terabyte archive." Okafor said it without satisfaction. He said it, the way someone says something that is true and significant and also represents 16 months of work that had been harder than it should have been. "We also have a problem, Solis," Caldwell said. Okafor looked at him. "You know, Nora flagged it at 4:15 this morning." Solis's reaction to the Greer name was wrong. She told Nora to hold the Greer connection pending jurisdictional review. Caldwell kept his voice low. 16 months is a long time for a parallel track not to touch the DOJ case. "Solis has been managing the boundary between the two investigations," Okafor said. "We don't know yet whether that management is institutional caution or something else. What I can tell you is that the audio on the USB drive, the file you found this morning, that file was in Foss's personal insurance package. Foss put it where he thought the DOJ team would find it." Caldwell was quiet for a moment. He knew about the DOJ placement. He's known for at least 6 months. The payments routed through Halcyon include 2 disbursements we can now trace to a Hutzout account connected to DOJ operational funding oversight. Okafor watched Morrow in the parking lot. Foss wasn't just running coercion inside the department. He was being paid to watch the watchers. The weight of that arranged itself in Caldwell's chest, in the way that things have arranged themselves when you realize the problem is larger than the solution you built for it. He looked at the substation door. Inside, Nora Vass was at the break room table with a cup of coffee and a stack of transcript pages, and he knew without asking that she had already worked out most of what Okafor had just told him, because she had flagged Solis at 4 in the morning in a parking lot, operating on 9 hours of accumulated evidence and 9 years of reading Marin Solis's silences, and that kind of instinct wasn't guesswork. "Where is Foss now?" Caldwell asked. We have his vehicle on county traffic cameras heading north on Route 11 at approximately 6:45 p.m. last night. He stopped at a gas station in Millhaven, paid cash, which means he planned this, and after that, nothing. No further camera hits, no phone signal, no credit activity. Okafor put his hands in his jacket pockets. He's been running dark for 13 hours. He has money, Caldwell said. Cash disbursements in the records. He has access to cash. Whether he has it physically depends on what he moved before last night. Okafor looked at the Route 9 direction, toward the farm property, and its basement full of organized records. But here's the thing about Foss. He's been running this operation for 12 years. Careful. He kept copies. He built insurance into every layer. He paused. A man that careful doesn't run without a destination. He's not just running, Caldwell said. He's positioned. That's my read. He's somewhere he planned to be, with resources he staged in advance, waiting to see how the next 48 hours develop before he makes his next move. Okafor looked at him, which means he still thinks he has options. Nora heard the parking lot conversation end and Caldwell's footsteps coming back through the substation. She set down the transcript page she'd been reading a third of the way through the most recent monthly folder, which Caldwell had brought from the farm property in a sealed evidence bag after photographing everything in place, and looked up when he came into the break room. Told her about Foss. 13 hours dark, the gas station in Millhaven, the staged disappearance of a careful man. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, he called someone. Before he left. At some point between leaving the substation at 6 p.m. and arriving at the farm property. The satellite system there was operational. Priya's team confirmed it was powered when they arrived, and the transceiver was set to an outgoing frequency that's registered to a commercial relay service. He made contact. She looked at the transcript page. Question is who he called and what they told him. Called Morrow. Morrow wasn't his handler. She was the clean hands layer, the person who made sure the right cases closed and the right documents disappeared. Foss's direct relationship was with Greer. She turned the page over. And Greer's relationship is with whoever Foss called. Caldwell sat down across from her. You're saying there's a layer above Greer. There's always a layer above Greer. She said it without drama, because it wasn't dramatic. It was just the arithmetic of organized corruption at this scale. Greer is a county executive. He controls municipal finances and land use decisions and has influence over the sheriff's department through budget authority. That's significant local power. But Halcyon Construction operates across 6 counties. Contract awards go back 18 years and cover state-level infrastructure projects. She looked at him. Greer is the local node. Halcyon is the connective tissue. Whoever sits above Greer controls the larger network, the archive on the server. If it goes back 12 years and covers Halcyon's full operational period, it'll have the answer. She picked up her coffee, which is why Foss didn't destroy it. Caldwell frowned. He left it running. I thought that was the panic. He left it running because it's leverage, she said. Took the portable drives, which have enough material to make him valuable to whoever he's running to. But he left the server intact, powered, network disconnected, after we got there but running, before he expected us to find it. He wanted us to find it. She set the cup down. The server is his opening bid in a negotiation. Caldwell looked at the transcript pages on the table. He's going to offer cooperation. He's going to offer the layer above Greer, in exchange for a deal. She looked at the window. Parking lot was visible from the break room. Mara was still outside, her call long finished, now standing with Okafor while 2 FBI agents processed her credentials and briefcase. And whoever he's offering that name, that material is going to be significant enough that someone is going to be tempted to take the deal. You don't want to take it. I want every name in that archive. I don't want to trade 48 terabytes of organized evidence for one name that Foss chooses to give us. She looked at him. Foss has been running this for 12 years. He knows which threads to pull and which ones lead nowhere. If he manages his own cooperation, he manages the outcome. Caldwell was quiet. Then we need to get to him before he makes the offer. We need to figure out who he called, she said. That tells us where he is. The satellite transceiver logs from the farm property arrived at the substation at 9:14 transmitted securely from the Route 9 forensics team to Priya's workstation. The outgoing signal from the previous evening logged at 7:23 p.m. Approximately 90 minutes after Foss left, the substation had been routed through the commercial relay service and terminated at a receiver the relay service identified after an FBI emergency contact request. Private communications node registered to a consulting firm called Meridian Group LLC. Okafor's expression when he read the Meridian Group name told Nora it meant something to him. State level, he said. He said it to Nora, not to Caldwell, which told her he'd made a calculation about who in the room was tracking the same threads he was. Meridian Group provides communications and logistic, consulting to infrastructure development projects. Their client list is not public, but their registered operating area covers the six-county Halcyon construction corridor. They're Halcyon's contractor, Nora said, among others. They're also registered as a federal contractor through a subsidiary, which means their communications infrastructure has a compliance certification that makes it very difficult to access without specific federal authorization. He looked at the printout. Foss knew exactly who to call to put himself inside a protected communication channel. He's been planning this exit for a while, Caldwell said. The exit has a name, Okafor said. He set the printout down. Principal of Meridian Group is a man named Warren Stills. Former state-level economic development director. Left government 12 years ago and moved into private consulting. He paused. 12 years ago is when the Halcyon Contract Awards started growing beyond county-level infrastructure. Table was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at the printout. She looked at Okafor. Is Stills in the archive? We haven't gotten into the server content yet. The forensics team is cloning the drives. It'll be at least 4 hours before we have searchable content. He sat back. But Foss called Stills last night, which means Foss is with Stills, or Stills knows where Foss is. And Stills has federal contractor protection on his communications infrastructure, Caldwell said. Means you need specific authorization to access his records. Authorization that would normally run through the U.S. Attorney's office in this district, Okafor said. He looked at the window, through which the parking lot was visible, through which Morrow was visible, now seated in the back of one of the FBI vehicles. Creates a situation. Route around her office, Nora said. The Eastern District. Already in process, Okafor said. Takes time. Official channels, even emergency channels, take time. He looked at her. Meanwhile, Stills knows we found the farm property. Foss would have communicated that through whatever channel they established. Means both of them are making decisions right now about what they do next. Foss destroys the drives he took, Caldwell said. Not immediately. Those drives are his leverage. He doesn't destroy leverage before he's extracted value from it. Okafor looked at his phone. He'd been checking it intermittently, waiting for something. What he does is move, change location, change communication method, make himself harder to find before the authorization comes through. He looked up. We have a window. I don't know how long it is. Nora had been thinking about something since the name Meridian Group had appeared on the printout. She was thinking about a detail from the banker's box's one of the folder labels she'd seen on the shelving units in the basement. A label she hadn't been able to open because the forensics team was cataloging, and she wasn't supposed to disturb the documentation before it was photographed. The folder had been in the current year's box near the back, and its tab label had read MGWS in Foss's cramped vertical handwriting. Meridian Group, Warren Stills. Foss had a folder on Stills, which meant the coercion structure ran upward. Foss had surveillance material on Stills, the same way he had it on the officers in the department, which meant Stills was not Foss's protector. Stills was Foss's next layer of insurance. Foss isn't running to Stills, she said. He's running at Stills. Both men looked at her. He has a folder on Stills in the archive. Same coercion material he kept on the department officers. She looked at Okafor. He's not going to Stills for safety. He's going to Stills to collect. He's going to trade the incriminating drives for whatever Stills can give him money, a new identity, exit support using the threat of the archive as the negotiating instrument. A man blackmailing his own exit, Caldwell said. He's been doing this for 12 years. The only way he knows how to operate. She stood up from the table. Stills is the destination, not the refuge. And Stills, whoever he is and whatever he's built, is about to find out what it's like to be on the other side of that table. Harlan Greer was taken into federal custody at 107 A.M. at his residence, a colonial-style house in the Harlow County Executive District, well-maintained, with a 2-car garage and a flagpole in the front yard that had a county flag hanging from it, completely still in the cold morning air. The arrest team was FBI, not Marshal, because by 107 A.M., the jurisdictional authority for Greer's detention had been fully transferred to Okafor's public corruption unit, and the Harlow County warrant had been superseded by a federal arrest warrant signed by a judge in the Eastern District who had been briefed by phone at 8:45 a.m. and had signed within 20 minutes. Nora wasn't there for the arrest. She was at the substation, still working through the transcript pages, when Okafor got the confirmation call. He came to the break room doorway and said, "Greer's in custody." She looked up. "How was he?" "Quiet." His wife was there. He asked to call his attorney before they'd finished reading him his rights. Okafor leaned against the door frame. He looked like someone who's known this was coming and decided not to fight the moment itself. He knew, she said. He's known since the substation went dark last night. He's had 9 hours to accept it. His attorney's already talking about cooperation, Okafor said, which means Greer is going to try to give us stills before Foss does. Good, she said. Let them compete. Okafor looked at her for a moment. You've been awake for... Don't, she said, not rudely. Just the flat refusal of someone who knows exactly how long they've been awake and has already decided it's not the relevant variable. She looked back at the transcript. When does the server content become searchable? 2 hours, maybe less. The cloning is faster than they estimated. He looked at the papers on the table. What are you finding in the transcripts? The hospital documentation manipulation is more extensive than we built into the original case, she said. The falsified discharge records weren't just insurance fraud. Some of them were used to establish false medical histories for individuals connected to Halcyon contract litigation people who'd filed injury or contamination claims against Halcyon properties were showing up in hospital. Records with pre-existing conditions that didn't exist defeated their claims. She looked at the page. Valen General's billing codes were the mechanism. Whoever was running that inside the hospital was doing it through the floor supervisor's documentation system. Someone inside the hospital. Someone with access to the electronic records system and the authority to modify billing codes without triggering an audit flag. She looked up. That's not a nurse. That's administrative level, minimum, possibly higher. Okafor wrote something on the small notepad he'd been carrying all morning. I'll flag it for the forensics team's hospital records review. It's in the transcript, the conversation where Greer mentions the nurse rotation logs. He specifically said the logs should stay with the floor supervisor's office. She pushed the page toward him. He wasn't talking about medical nursing staff. He was talking about whoever manages the billing floor. Okafor read the page. He read it again. You caught this in a read-through. I've been in that hospital for 14 months, she said. I know how the documentation system works. He nodded slowly and took the page with him when he left. The server content began streaming to the FBI forensics system at 11:34 a. Priority search names, dates, financial codes ran as an automated pass, while the human team reviewed flagged segments. 12:15 p.m. The initial results were enough to require a secure evidence conference in the substation's largest room, which had been the break room until Caldwell converted it into the primary evidence staging area sometime around 9 in the morning. The automated search had returned hits on 312 unique names across the 48 terabytes. Of those, 67 were cross-referenced against existing federal case files in 4 different jurisdictions. 14 of those 67 were current or former elected or appointed officials. 3 were sitting state legislators. 1 was a federal court magistrate named Horace Vann, whose name appeared in the archive in connection with case docket manipulations going back 9 years. Caldwell read the magistrate's name off the summary sheet and set it down on the table without comment. The room Okafor, Nora Priya, 2 FBI analysts, and Erickson from the Marshal team absorbed it without comment. Then Caldwell said, "This investigation is going to be larger than this room can manage." "It already is," Okafor said. "I've been on the phone with headquarters since 8 a. They're standing up a task force. Multi-agency, centralized coordination, separate from the DOJ case structure." He looked at the summary sheet. The Harlow substation becomes a field evidence point, not the operational center. "What about Solis?" Nora asked. The room was careful about that question. Everyone in it had been careful about that question for the past 6 hours. "Solis is being interviewed by DOJ Internal Affairs right now," Okafor said. "In Washington. She got on a plane at 7 this morning." He looked at Nora. "Not because she was ordered to. She requested it. She knew she was exposed," Nora said. "She knew the moment you told her Caldwell had called the U.S. attorney," Okafor said. "Whether her management of the boundary between investigations was a policy decision or something else, that's what Internal Affairs is determining." He paused. "My read, for what it's worth, is that Solis was protecting a larger operation she couldn't disclose, and it didn't occur to her until this morning that the larger operation had been compromised from inside." "Foss," Nora said. "If Foss had DOJ operational intelligence and the payment records suggest he did, then whatever parallel operation Solis was protecting was already compromised. She just didn't know it." He looked at the table. "Which means she was protecting something that had stopped being protected the moment Foss got access to it." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Harlow County substation parking lot was now occupied by 9 federal vehicles, a county public affairs officer who had arrived at 10 a.m. and been politely told to wait, and 2 local news vehicles whose crews were filming from the public road, unable to get close enough to see anything meaningful but unwilling to leave. "Foss," Caldwell said. "We still don't have him." "We have a location," Okafor said. He looked at his phone. The call he'd been waiting for had arrived at some point in the last 20 minutes, and he'd taken it outside while the evidence conference was assembling. Stills owns a property in the northern part of the county, a lake house, off Route 4. It's not registered to Stills directly. It's in the name of a Meridian Group subsidiary, but the utilities are on, and there's been cell activity consistent with 2 devices in the area in the last 4 hours. "Foss and Stills," Caldwell said, "and whatever drives Foss took from the farm property." Okafor set his phone face down on the table. The Eastern District authorization for Meridian Group communications came through 40 minutes ago. "We have what we need to approach the property." Nora looked at him. "When?" "The approach team is already positioned on Route 4. They've been waiting for the authorization." He looked at Caldwell, then at Nora. "We're moving in 11 minutes. She stood up from the table. "I'm going." Okafor looked at her for a moment, not a challenge, just a reading. She was in the same blue hospital scrubs she'd been wearing for 26 hours. Her shoulder was doing the grinding thing again, and she was aware of it. The way you're aware of something that isn't going to stop you. Slept. She'd had 3 cups of coffee and 1 granola bar, and she had 14 months of this county's details organized in her head, and she was the person in this room who knew what Warren Stills's name had meant when Foss put it on a folder tab. "You're going as a federal investigator, not as tactical support," Okafor said. "Understood. You stay with the command vehicle." "Stay with the command vehicle." He nodded. "Get a vest from Erickson." Route 4 North ran through pine forest and lake country, the kind of Harlow County terrain that looked like vacation real estate and functioned as something else when the right people owned the right properties. The FBI approach team, 8 agents, 2 tactical, 6 support, had staged in a gravel turnout 3/4 of a mile from the Meridian Group property entrance. Nora was in the command vehicle with Okafor and a communications officer named Barrett, watching the approach on a tablet feed from the 2 body cameras leading the team up the access road. The lake house was visible on the feed at 12:58 p.m., a substantial structure, cedar-sided, with a deck overlooking a gray November lake. 2 vehicles in the driveway, a dark SUV with rental plates, and a sedan registered, the quick check confirmed, to a holding company in the Meridian Group subsidiary network. The rental was Foss. He'd planned for a clean vehicle. Tactical team made the approach in the standard pattern. Nora watched the tablet. The body camera footage was steady. The agents moved through the pine trees on either side of the access road, used the tree cover, maintained spacing. No visible perimeter surveillance. 1 light on inside the house, visible through the deck-facing windows. The knock on the front door, when it came, was unhurried. "Official and clear, FBI, open the door." 12 seconds of silence. Then the door opened. Warren Stills was 64, heavyset, with the kind of face that had once been commanding and had settled into something harder and more defensive over years of operating in spaces where he was never fully visible. He looked at the badge the lead agent held out, and then looked past the agent at the team behind him, and his expression went through several things: quickly surprise that he failed to entirely suppress, calculation, and then something that resolved into the particular stillness of a man who has been found and is deciding how to be found. "Where is Gerald Foss?" the lead agent said. Stills said, "I want my attorney." "Where is Gerald Foss?" From inside the house there was a sound, not a voice, something physical, something falling. Then a door inside the structure opened, and a figure moved in the light behind Stills, and the tactical agents at the flanks were already moving when Gerald Foss appeared in the interior hallway. Still in the clothes he'd left the substation in the previous evening, looking like a man who had been awake all night making calculations, and had just realized that every one of them had come out wrong. He looked at the agents. He looked past them, toward the command vehicle at the end of the driveway. From that distance, he probably couldn't see Nora clearly, but she could see him, the face of a man who had run an information control operation inside Harlow County law enforcement for 12 years, who had built coercion infrastructure and maintained insurance files on everyone above and below him, who had called his own exit and driven dark for 13 hours, and arrived at his carefully staged destination, only to find that the destination had been found first. His hands were empty. He raised them without being asked. From the command vehicle, Nora watched the lead agent step past Stills into the doorway. She watched Foss's face when the agent said the words, "You are under federal arrest," and she watched him absorb it with the exhausted recognition of a man who knows the exits have been closed not by force, but by the slow accumulation of his own. Records against him, 48 terabytes of organized testimony that he'd built himself over 12 years and left running in a basement, blinking steady green, waiting. On the table in the command vehicle, Okafor's phone lit up with a message from the Eastern District. He read it, set the phone down, and said, "Magistrate Van just filed for an emergency recusal on 3 active cases." Nora looked at him. "He's seen the server content list," Okafor said. "Someone leaked him the name index." He looked at the phone. "He filed recusal before we could flag the cases ourselves. Trying to control the damage. He's trying to look cooperative." Okafor picked up the phone, which means he knows the archive has enough on him that cooperation is his only option. Nora watched the agents walk Foss and Stills out of the house, separate toward separate vehicles. Neither of them looked at each other, the particular isolation of 2 men who had been operating as a system and had both just become individual problems. Barrett, the communications officer, looked up from his station. "Okafor, there's a call coming through the secure relay. It's flagged as personal priority for Investigator Vass." Okafor looked at Nora. She leaned across and looked at the caller identification on Barrett's screen. It was Vallon General Medical Center, the main line, not a direct extension. She felt something shift in her chest, not fear, not quite, but the specific alertness of someone who recognizes a pattern they didn't expect to see here. She had spent 14 months in that hospital. She had real patients there, real colleagues. She had left at the end of a shift last night and been stopped on Mercer Road, and the rest of the night had happened. She had not once looked back at the hospital as an active part of the case because she had assumed that the documentation manipulation ran through the billing floor, through administrative records, through a system that operated above the clinical level. She had assumed. She picked up the relay handset, Vass. The voice on the other end was Dr. Elaine Turco, the chief of trauma medicine at Vallon General, whom Nora had worked alongside for 14 months and who had been, in Nora's assessment, exactly what she appeared to be: a competent, overworked physician with no connection to the financial manipulation in the billing system. Turco's voice right now did not sound like an overworked physician. It sounded like someone who had been holding something for a long time and had just decided she couldn't hold it anymore. "Nora," Turco said, "I need to tell you something. I should have told you. I should have told someone months ago." Nora said, "What is it, Elaine?" "The floor supervisor who manages the billing documentation," Turco said, "Trisha Meal. I've known for 8 months that she was altering discharge records. Reported it internally." She stopped. "The internal report went to the hospital's legal liaison. And the legal liaison, his name is Conrad Hale. I found out 3 months ago that Hale has a consulting relationship with Halcyon Construction Group. Command vehicle was very quiet. I didn't know what to do," Turco said. "I reported internally, and the report went to the person it needed to be kept from. And then I was afraid that if I went external, if I went to the state medical board or to federal authorities, that someone would ask why I waited 8 months. Her voice was unsteady but controlled the voice of a person working very hard to say something accurately under pressure. I was afraid of what it would look like." Nora looked at Okafor. She looked at the agents walking Foss toward the vehicle in the driveway. She looked at the lake, flat and gray through the pine trees. "Indifferent." "Elaine," she said, "I need you to not speak to anyone at the hospital right now. Not Hale, not Meal, not administration. Can you do that?" "Yes. I'm going to send someone to you within the hour. Someone with federal credentials. You're going to tell them exactly what you told me." She paused. "You're not in trouble. But I need you to stay put and stay quiet until that person arrives. Okay?" A breath on the line. "Nora, I'm sorry. I should have—" "You called now," Nora said. "That's what matters." She handed the relay back to Barrett and looked at Okafor. "Vallon General. The billing floor manipulation runs through the hospital's internal legal liaison, who has a Halcyon consulting relationship. There's a direct witness, the chief of trauma medicine, who reported internally 8 months ago and has been sitting on it since." Okafor's expression processed this in about 2 seconds. "The hospital documentation isn't just a manipulation mechanism. It's a node. It's a connected node," she said. "Conrad Hale at the hospital, Patricia Meal on the billing floor, the falsified medical histories for Halcyon litigation claimants. This is how the construction contracts stayed clean. When workers or neighboring property owners filed claims against Halcyon projects, their medical records were altered to defeat the claims." She looked at him steadily. "That means there are people who lost cases they should have won, who didn't get compensation for real injuries because their hospital records said the injuries were pre-existing. It's a civil's liability case, the size of a building, Okafor said. That's why Hale is the legal liaison, and not just a billing administrator, she said. Been managing the exposure. Every falsified record is a settled claim or a dismissed suit. The archive will have the case numbers. Okafor already had his phone out. And in the driveway of the lake house on Route 4, Gerald Foss sat in the back of an FBI vehicle with his hands in zip cuffs and his travel bag in the trunk, and the portable drives the ones he'd taken from the farm property, the ones he'd thought were his leverage in an evidence bag being photographed by an FBI technician, and the window of negotiation he'd been planning for 13 hours had just been closed from a direction he hadn't considered. Trauma physician in blue scrubs who had picked up the phone and decided that 8 months was long enough to carry something alone. Dr. Elaine Turco was still at her desk in the Trauma Department Administrative Office when the FBI agent arrived 47 minutes later. She had done what Nora told her, stayed put, said nothing to anyone, closed her office door and sat with the thing she'd been carrying for 8 months and felt it change shape now that she'd said it out loud to another person. That was the thing about silence. It felt like protection until the moment you broke it, and then you realized it had been weight the whole time. The agent was a woman named Solis, not Maren Solis. A different Solis entirely, which Nora had noted with the brief, tired irony of someone who'd been awake for too long, and she was professional and patient, and took Turco's statement in full, without rushing her, without editorial response. Turco walked her through the 8 months, the discharge records she'd flagged, the internal report she'd filed, the moment 3 months ago when she'd found out that Conrad Hale had a financial relationship with the construction company, whose litigation claimants kept appearing in her hospital's records with conveniently pre-existing conditions. She walked the agent through the specific cases she remembered, 4 of them. Workers from a halcyon drainage project in the western part of the county who had developed respiratory conditions consistent with chemical exposure and whose Volun General records had been modified to show histories. Asthma and allergies that predated the project. She remembered their faces. She had treated 2 of them personally. She knew what their baseline respiratory function had looked like when they first came in, and she knew what the record said afterward, and those 2 things were not the same. The agent wrote everything down. When it was over, Turco sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. What happens to the patients? The ones who lost their cases? That's going to be part of the civil review, the agent said. Every falsified record is a potential basis for case reopening. That takes years, yes, the agent said. She didn't try to soften it. Does. Turco nodded. She already knew that. She just needed to hear someone say it with an honest face. Conrad Hale was taken into custody at Volun General's administrative offices at 2:34 p. He was not the kind of man who made scenes. He was 58, measured, the kind of hospital administrator who communicated through memoranda and had probably not raised his voice professionally in 15 years. He said nothing when the agents presented the arrest warrant. He asked for his attorney with the quiet precision of someone who had a number memorized for exactly this contingency and had been keeping it memorized for some time. Patricia Meal, the billing floor supervisor, was arrested at her home at 3:01 p.m., she cried. Not from remorse, or not only from remorse, but from the particular shock of someone who had told herself for years that what she was doing existed in a gray area and was confronting the moment when that self-told story stopped working. The agents were professional. They did not comment on the crying. They walked her to the vehicle and she went. The Halcyon Construction Group's county operations office was served with a federal preservation order at 2:55 p.m., and by 4 p.m., the company's legal team had filed 3 separate emergency motions in the Eastern District that the Eastern District judge reviewed and denied before 5 o'clock. Halcyon's CEO, a man named Douglas Farr, who had been reachable by phone all morning, and then, around noon, stopped being reachable, was located at an airport in the adjacent county at 4:47 p.m. attempting to board a private charter flight to a destination that his attorney, reached separately, declined to specify. The agents who met him at the gate were polite. Farr was not, but it didn't matter. Nora heard the Farr arrest confirmation through Okafor's phone while they were still on Route 4, the FBI vehicles in the lake house driveway, the forensics team working through the property. She was sitting on the running board of the command vehicle, with her back against the door, her legs stretched out in front of her, doing nothing for approximately 4 minutes, which was the first time she had done nothing in 31 hours. The lake was visible through the pines. Gray water. No wind. The surface completely still, in the way that November lakes go still, when the summer people have left, and the cold has settled in, and the water is just water again. Not scenery. Okafor came and stood beside her. He looked at the lake. Far's in custody, I heard. That's the full network. Greer, Morrow, Foss, Stills, Far, Hale, Meal. The department officers from the warrant list are being processed at the substation. He put his hands in his pockets. It's a significant day. It's a long day, she said. He sat down on the running board next to her, which she hadn't expected. Okafor had the bearing of a man who maintained professional verticality under most circumstances, and sitting on a vehicle's running board in a pine forest was not quite in that register. But he sat, and they both looked at the lake for a moment. Paulson, she said. He's cooperating fully. The warrant instruction is a federal charge, but his cooperation is substantive. He's provided testimony about specific incidents of directed evidence tampering that he witnessed, but wasn't ordered to participate in. The federal prosecutor is reviewing his exposure. He paused. He's not getting a free pass. I'm not asking for one. I know. He looked at the water. He's getting a fair process, which is more than the people he worked for gave to anyone. She nodded. That was enough. She hadn't wanted justice to bend for Paulson. She'd wanted it to apply to him the same way it was supposed to apply to everyone, without exemption, without manipulation, without the particular kind of corrosion that happened, when the people running the process also needed the process to protect them. A fair process. In Harlow County, in the years she'd spent in it, that had been the thing most comprehensively absent. Not dramatic cruelty, though some of what Fasa's archive documented was genuinely cruel, but the steady, organized removal of fairness from the mechanisms that were supposed to guarantee it. The way corruption at this scale actually worked. Not explosively, procedurally. Through the accumulation of small decisions by people who told themselves they were in a gray area, until the gray area was the only area anyone could see. She thought about the 4 workers with the falsified respiratory records, cases they'd lost, the compensation they hadn't received, the years of that. She thought about them in the way that you think about strangers whose specific faces you've never seen but whose situation has become concrete to you through evidence, through transcripts, through the handwriting of the man who kept organized records of their defeat. They were real people. The corruption had real people inside it, not as abstractions, not as statistics, but as specific individuals who had walked into Valen General with damaged lungs and walked out with medical records that said the damage was their own fault. Getting to Foss's archive hadn't fixed what happened to them. It just made it visible, and making it visible was the beginning of the only process that might eventually lead somewhere better. She stood up from the running board. Her shoulder complained. She ignored it. I need a ride back to the substation, she said. Marin Solis's internal affairs interview in Washington lasted 6 hours. The outcome was not an arrest. The evidence of her direct complicity was circumstantial, built on patterns of information management rather than documented corruption, but the outcome was also not a clean clearance. The DOJ Inspector General's office opened a formal review of how the parallel investigation had been managed, and Solis was placed on administrative leave pending that review. She submitted her leave without protest, which the Inspector General's office noted in the opening documentation as consistent with either a clear conscience or a very good attorney, and at this stage it was impossible to say which. Nora learned this from a text message sent by a DOJ colleague she'd worked with before the Harlow placement. Someone's outside the Solis chain of command, outside the compromised layers. Someone who had gotten her a coffee at an airport once, and who she trusted for exactly that reason. Text said Solis on leave. Review open, no charges yet. Complicated. And then, you okay? She texted back, getting there. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked into the substation. The formal evidence briefing was held at 6 p.m. in the substation's largest room, which had been the break room 12 hours ago, and was now a full federal evidence staging area with whiteboards and a projector and enough people in it that the standing room arrangement included the hallway. Okafor ran it. He was methodical, clear, and moved through the evidence architecture with the precision of someone who had been building this structure in his head for 16 months and was now finally constructing it out loud. The network was mapped on the primary whiteboard, Halcyon at the financial center, Greer as the county authority layer, Foss as the information control layer inside the department, Morrow as the prosecutorial protection layer, Stills as the external communications and logistics infrastructure, Farr as the corporate execution arm, Hale and Meal as the hospital documentation nodes. 12 years of organized corruption, 6 counties of reach, 48 terabytes of self-documented evidence left behind by a man who had been too careful about his own insurance to consider that his insurance was also his indictment. When Okafor finished the overview, he said, "The investigation going forward transfers to the multi-agency task force. Field evidence operations in Harlow County are complete. He looked around the room. I want to acknowledge the work of the people in this room, and specifically the 14-month undercover placement that made this operation possible. He looked at Nora, who was standing near the back wall because the chairs were full. Investigator Vass identified the Greer connection, flagged the chain of command compromise, recognized the coercion structure in the server archive, and identified the hospital documentation network all in a single operational night after a shift. He paused. It's not a small thing. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has been working a hard day and has the good sense to let a moment of acknowledgement land without applause. Nora didn't say anything. She nodded once. It was enough. Press conference was held the following morning on the steps of the federal courthouse in the county seat, attended by representatives from the FBI, the DOJ, and the U.S. Marshal Service, plus the Eastern District's acting U.S. Attorney not Morrow, who had been suspended pending investigation, but a deputy who read a prepared statement with the careful precision of someone navigating a media situation that was larger than the county's media infrastructure had any experience processing. Cameras were there. Local television, 2 regional outlets, and 1 national wire service whose correspondent had driven up from the city at 4 in the morning when the story started moving through official channels. The charges were read: Harlan Greer, racketeering, extortion, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. Gerald Foss, racketeering, extortion, witness tampering, obstruction, coercion of law enforcement personnel. Kathleen Morrow, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, conspiracy. Warren Stills, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction. Douglas Farr, racketeering, conspiracy, fraud. Conrad Hale, fraud, conspiracy, falsification of medical records. Patricia Meal, falsification of medical records, fraud. 14 officers from the Harlow County Sheriff's Department charged under the federal corruption statute, and read last after everything else in a single sentence by the acting U.S. Attorney a formal referral to the State Medical Review Board and the Civil Division of the Eastern District for the reopening of cases connected to falsified hospital documentation, including the 4 respiratory injury cases from the Halcyon Drainage Project and 11 additional identified cases still being cataloged from the server archive. That last sentence was the one that mattered most, and it was the one that nobody in the press gathered on the courthouse steps had been expecting, because it was the sentence that made the story larger than a corruption case. It was the sentence that said, real people were hurt, the record of that hurt was deliberately falsified, and the falsification is now documented, and the cases are coming back open. Nora was not at the press conference. She was at Valen General. She had gone home for 6 hours showered, slept in the manner of someone who falls into sleep like falling into water and comes back out of it, still tired but functional, and then put on her scrubs and drove to the hospital. Not because anyone had told her to. Her undercover placement was officially closed. The DOJ had formally ended her field assignment with a document she'd signed at the substation at 8 p.m. the previous evening. She had no professional obligation to be at Valen General. She went because she worked there. Not because she'd been placed there, because she'd spent 14 months taking care of patients in that building. And those patients had not stopped being her patients, because the operation was over. The woman in room 4 with the femur fracture had been her patient for 3 days. Teenage boy in the trauma bay with the lacerated forearm from a car window accident, she'd been there when he came in. 2 nights ago, what felt like a different life ago. And she'd been the one who called his mother on the break room phone while the surgical team prepped him. She walked into the nursing station at 8:14 a.m. And Carla Dinn, the day shift charge nurse, looked up from the scheduling board and said, "You're not on today." "I know," Nora said. "I wanted to check in." Dinn looked at her for a moment. Everyone in the hospital knew by now. What had happened there had been federal agents in the administrative wing for the better part of yesterday, and Conrad Hale's arrest had not been a quiet one. The billing floor was currently operating under federal oversight, with a temporary supervisor brought in from the Regional Health Authority. The hospital's CEO had called an all-staff meeting for the afternoon, which was going to be an interesting meeting. "The boy from the car accident," Nora said. "Jamie Aldretti. What's his status?" "Discharged this morning," Dinn said. "Good. His mom came in at 7, Nora nodded. "And Mrs. Park in room 4? "Surgery went well. She's in recovery." Dinn looked at her with the particular expression of a colleague who wants to say something and isn't sure how to frame it. "Nora." What you did? I was doing my job, Nora said. Both jobs. Din looked at her for a moment. Then she said quietly, the records that were changed. Some of those people were our patients. I know. I didn't know. I want you to know that I didn't know. I know you didn't, Nora said. And she did know she had spent 14 months watching her colleagues, the actual clinical staff, and she had seen clearly the difference between the people who were part of the manipulation and the people who simply came to work and tried to take care of people and had no idea what was happening in the billing system above their level. Most of the hospital staff were in the second category. Din was in the second category. Is it going to hurt the hospital? Din asked. The hospital is going to go through a difficult process, Nora said. What the billing manipulation did, the falsified records, the altered histories, that's going to require a full audit, and it's going to be in the news, and it's going to be uncomfortable. She looked at Din steadily. The hospital didn't do those things. 2 people in administrative positions did them. And the clinical staff, the nurses, the physicians, what you did every day was real. Care was real. You don't lose that because the billing floor was compromised. Din nodded. She looked like someone who needed to hear that and was trying to decide whether she was allowed to be reassured by it. Go home, Din said finally. You've been up for what, 30 hours? 36 approximately. Go home, Nora. She stayed for another 40 minutes. She checked on Mrs. Park in recovery awake, groggy, asking about her daughter and sat with her for a few minutes, which she would have done on any regular shift. She filled out 2 documentation forms that were technically outside her scheduled hours, and that the day shift charge would have handled without complaint, but that she had started and wanted to finish. Small things, real things. The kinds of things that the job actually consisted of on most days, in between the extraordinary ones. When she left, she took the long way through the lobby. Past the administrative wing. Where the door to Conrad Hale's office was open, he was gone. His desk cleared. The Federal Preservation seal on the filing cabinet visible through the doorway. She passed the billing floor entrance, where a woman she didn't recognize was at the supervisor's station reviewing a stack of files, with the careful attention of someone brought in to reconstruct something that had been deliberately broken. She walked out through the main entrance and into the cold November air, and she stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed it. Derek Paulson was formally charged 6 days later. The federal prosecutor accepted his cooperation testimony as substantive and reflected that in the charging document, not a dismissal, not a free pass, but a charge that accurately reflected both his conduct and his cooperation, which was what a fair process was supposed to produce. He lost his badge immediately, which had been inevitable from the moment he broke the seal on a federal warrant, because he decided the woman in the driver's seat wasn't worth the inconvenience of following instructions. He would lose his pension to the federal asset forfeiture process connected to the department's overall corruption findings. He would not lose his freedom. The prosecutor's assessment of his role landed him below the threshold of the more serious charges, but he would spend 2 years under federal supervision, and the record of what he'd done would follow him. He was told about the final charging decision by his attorney in a conference room at the Federal Public Defender's office, and afterward he sat in the parking lot of that building for 20 minutes in his own car, the personal car, not the cruiser which had been surrendered weeks ago, and thought about a woman in blue hospital scrubs sitting on the gravel shoulder of Mercer Road at 11:47 p. M telling him not to open the envelope. He had made a decision in that moment. He had made it before she finished the sentence. He had made it before his brain had finished processing the weight of the envelope, the quality of the seal, the flatness of her voice. He had made it because she was a nurse in a battered Honda Civic, and he was an officer with a badge and a flashlight and a particular kind of certainty about what those things meant in relation to each other. He had been wrong about what they meant. He had been wrong in a way that was ordinary, not monstrous, not calculated, but ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was the part that stayed with him. The system he'd worked inside had been rotten from the top down, but the rot hadn't forced his hand on Mercer Road. That had been his own hand, his own thumb on the wax seal, his own decision, made in the dark on a gravel shoulder, about who the woman in the driver's seat was allowed to be. He drove home. He didn't have anywhere else to go. Harlan Greer entered a guilty plea 7 weeks after his arrest, which surprised no one in the federal prosecutor's office. The archive evidence was comprehensive enough that going to trial would have been an exercise in documented self-destruction. And Greer had the particular practical intelligence of a man who recognized when a position was indefensible. Plea covered racketeering, extortion, and obstruction. The sentencing guidelines put him at 12 to 18 years, and the judge, a different judge from Magistrate Vann, who was navigating his own federal review process, indicated at the plea hearing that she would be looking at the high end of that range, given the scope and duration of the conduct. Gerald Foss went to trial. He was the only one who did. His attorney made the argument that his records-keeping operation had been performed under duress, that Greer Stills had used his own surveillance material against him to compel his participation in the coercion structure. It was not a frivolous argument, and the jury considered it for 2.5 days. Rejected it. The evidence was specific enough, the duration was long enough, and the sophistication of the operation was documented thoroughly enough in 48 terabytes of Foss's own archived material that the duress argument ran into the fundamental problem of a man who had spent 12 years organizing the evidence of his own agency. Convicted on 17 counts. The sentence was 22 years. Kathleen Morrow negotiated a plea that acknowledged her role in suppressing the Harlow County Municipal Finance Inquiry and directing documentation treasures that benefited Greer's network. She avoided the more serious racketeering charges by providing detailed cooperation testimony about the communication structure between her office, Stills, and Greer testimony that helped prosecutors reconstruct the decision-making timeline and attribute specific acts to specific individuals. She was disbarred. She received 4 years with the possibility of supervised release after 3. Warren Stills, who had spent 40 years building an operation that was specifically designed to be insulated from exactly this kind of outcome, received 14 years. His attorneys were good. The archive was better. Douglas Farr at Halcyon received 11 years. The company's county contracts were voided, and a separate civil action was filed by the Eastern District on behalf of the workers and property owners whose claims had been defeated through falsified medical records. The civil action identified 31 individual cases for reopening. It would take years to resolve. Some of those people would receive compensation. Some of them would not live long enough for the process to conclude because that was how long the process took and how old some of them were. That was the part that couldn't be made right by a verdict. The verdicts were necessary. They were not sufficient. They were what was available. Patricia Meal received 18 months and permanent suspension of her medical records certification. Conrad Hale received 3 years and disbarment from Healthcare Administration. Volun General's full billing audit took 4 months and identified 11 additional cases of record falsification, which were added to the civil action. The 14 officers from the Harlow County Sheriff's Department received sentences ranging from 8 months to 6 years, depending on their individual levels of participation. Sergeant Raymond Kell, who had told everyone to stay where they were the night of the raid and had not been on the warrant list, was retained and placed in a supervisory role during the department's federal oversight period, which would last 3 years. Deputy Carla Metz, who had filed 2 internal complaints that had been suppressed, received a formal letter of recognition from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Put it in her desk drawer and didn't tell anyone about it. 3 months after the arrest of Harlan Greer, Nora Vass sat in a conference room at the FBI's regional field office and listened to a man named Director Elliot Mash explain that the Public Corruption Unit was establishing a permanent rural embedded investigative program and that she was being offered the position of program director. It was not a small offer. It was the kind of offer that was made to people who had demonstrated a specific capacity, the ability to work inside a community for an extended period, without the community knowing what they were doing, and to do it without losing track of what it was for. She had spent 14 months in Harlow County being a nurse. She had genuinely been a nurse. She had cared for real patients and done real work and built real relationships, and she had also been documenting organized corruption that went further than anyone had known and had, on the night it came apart, kept enough clarity to recognize which threads led where before the sun came up. Program would be national scope, Mash said. You'd be identifying placement candidates, building the methodology, overseeing active placements. How many simultaneous placements, she asked. Projecting 4 to 6 in the first year. It's not enough staff to run them properly. We're building the staff around the program director's specifications, he said. She looked at the table. She thought about the 4 workers with the falsified respiratory records. She thought about the 11 additional cases, the 31 in the civil action. She thought about what it meant that a county in Harlow County had been systematically protected from accountability for 12 years by a structure that was comprehensive enough to include a lieutenant's surveillance operation, an AUSA, county executive, and a construction company's CEO, and that the structure had been visible for parts of those 12 years to people who had not known what to do with what they saw. She thought about Elaine Turco, holding a reported internal complaint for 8 months because she didn't know who to trust with it. I have a condition, she said. Mash looked at her. Program needs a civilian reporting integration component. A way for people inside institutions, hospitals, municipalities, county departments to report what they see to the program directly, without going through the institutional chain that may already be compromised. She looked at him steadily. What stopped this from coming apart sooner wasn't the absence of people who knew something was wrong. It was the absence of a safe place to put what they knew. Turco knew. She reported internally, and her report went to the wrong person. Metz knew. She filed complaints that got buried. She paused. I'm not interested in building a program that's only as good as the people we place inside. I want a program that captures what the people already inside already know. Mash was quiet for a moment. That's a significant structural addition. Yes, it would require separate authorization and funding. I know, she held his gaze, that's the condition. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a senior administrator who has just been given a condition by someone he wants to hire and is calculating the distance between what he's been authorized to offer and what she's asking for. Give me the design document, he said finally. I'll take it to the deputy director. I'll have it in 2 weeks, she said. She left the conference room and walked down the corridor of the regional field office and out through the lobby, past the security desk, and through the glass doors and into the afternoon air, which was cold and smelled like the city exhaust and concrete and the distant bakery smell from somewhere down the block. Stood on the front steps for a moment. She was 37 years old. She had a shoulder that ached in cold weather and a nursing license that was fully active and a field record that now included 14 months in Harlow County and the dismantling of a 12-year corruption network that had injured more people than the final charge count reflected. Because charge counts were about what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, and what could be proven was always a fraction of what had actually happened. She had not set us out to become the kind of person whose name got attached to something that large. She had set at each stage to do the next right thing with the information and skills she had available, treat the patient in front of her, document the pattern she was seeing, flag the anomaly that didn't fit, hold the line when the line needed holding. It was not a triumphant sequence. It was a working one. It included errors in judgment, things she should have seen sooner. 14 months of performing ordinary when she was exhausted and sick of the smell of institutional laundry detergent and the fluorescent lights of the Harlow substation and the particular repetitive conversations. County that didn't know it was being watched. She was not a story about exceptional people doing exceptional things. She was a story about a person with specific training doing a hard job carefully and at length and not stopping when it got heavy. She thought about that for a moment on the steps of the field office. Then she thought about the design document she needed to write and the staff she needed to build and the 4 to 6 placements that would need to be running within a year, and she started going through the list of people she knew who had the right combination of professional cover observational discipline and tolerance for the extended ordinary. It was a short list. It needed to be longer. She went home to start writing. 6 months later, the first case opened under the embedded reporting program was in a mid-sized city 4 states east of Harlow County, in a municipal water authority whose procurement records had been flagged by a civilian employee who had filed a report through the program's external intake portal, the component that MASH had eventually gotten authorized. After 3 weeks of negotiation and a funding transfer that Nora had drafted the justification for herself, in precise and uncharitable language about what the absence of such infrastructure had cost Harlow County in measurable civil damages. The civilian employee's name was a man named Terrence, and he was a records clerk, and he had noticed that certain vendor payments didn't match the services documented in the contract files, and he had noticed this for 8 months, and he had not reported it internally because his supervisor signed the payments, and he didn't know what came above his supervisor in the chain that he was supposed to trust. He had found the intake portal through a public information campaign. He had submitted his report at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday from his home computer, and the report had been received, reviewed, and assigned to a program investigator by 8 a.m. the following morning. Nora read the case summary at her desk in the regional field office and thought about Elaine Turco sitting alone with 8 months of knowledge and no safe place to put it. She thought about what changed when the safe place existed. Not what it fixed, it didn't fix what had already happened, but what it prevented from continuing. The difference between 8 months and 8 weeks. The difference between a corruption network that ran for 12 years and one that ran for 3, because somewhere in the third year a records clerk found a portal on a website and decided to type what he knew into a form and press submit. She approved the case assignment and moved to the next file. Outside the window, the city went about its business in the particular way that cities do, enormous and indifferent, and full of people doing their jobs, most of them ordinary, most of them trying, most of them unaware of the specific places where the structure they were inside had begun to quietly fail. They were not waiting to be saved. They were waiting for a system that worked the way it was supposed to work, and when it didn't, they needed somewhere to say so. That was what she was building. Not a monument to what had happened in Harlow County. A mechanism for the next time, and the time after that, and every ordinary Tuesday night when someone sitting at its desk noticed something that didn't add up, and needed to know that noticing was enough, of seeing clearly and saying so was enough, that the power to change a rotten thing didn't live only with the people inside the rotten thing, but with anyone patient enough to look and honest enough to speak. The nurse everyone had underestimated had understood that for a long time. Now she was building the infrastructure for everyone else to understand it too. She opened the next file,